Welcome to this compilation of 5 smart and surprising science fiction short stories. I'll be narrating A Touch of E-Flat by Joe Gibson, Puppet Government by George Revelle, Retief of the Red Tape Mountain by Keith Laumer, Operation R.S.V.P by H. Beam Piper, and Happy Ending by Henry Kuttner and C. L. Moore. If you like this kind of video, consider signing up to my Patreon. There you can listen to exclusive novelettes that will never make it to YouTube, like Trouble on Titan by Henry Kuttner or The 64 Square Madhouse by Fritz Leiber. Plus, you get 6-month early access to all novels I narrate. The most recent of these is Worlds of the Imperium by Keith Laumer. It's a lot of fun. If you're interested in that, head to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF. But for now, let's get to the 5 stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. A Touch of E-Flat by Joe Gibson. Narrated by William Sky. Warning: never let anyone point any weapon at you, even something as harmless looking as a water pistol. It may be a cooling gun. Most people can find something wrong with the world, and some make a practice of it, but few people ever get the chance to do something about it. And those few usually go down in history with a resounding crash. Well, it's been rather noisy around here. From the very beginning, it had been my intention to write this account, but I certainly hadn't intended to write it while residing under police surveillance in the recuperating ward of St. Luke's Memorial Hospital. Nor did I expect the interest and encouragement of the police officer who put me here. Nonetheless, Sergeant Nicholas Valaska of the Ohio State Police has been most helpful both in the many long discussions we have had and in procuring the notes and data from my laboratory for the preparation of this manuscript. But I'm afraid there shall be a considerable lot of me in this manuscript, which, I hastily assert, is not its purpose at all. My apologies for that. Fact is, there's a considerable lot of me, as anyone can see. The term I rather prefer using is roly-poly. For the record, however, I am duly certified at birth as one Albert Jamieson Cooling, to which has been added, by my own modest efforts, a few odd alphabetic symbols such as MS and PhD. I am currently holding down a professorship at a small privately endowed tech college, have some mentionable background in both nuclear physics and biochemistry, possess a choice collection of rather good jazz records, have a particular fondness for barbecued spare ribs, and of late have become an inventor. If I've left something out, such as horn-rimmed glasses, then by the point of my little black beard, it must be the wardrobe of 36 sports jackets. Wives? Well, I've been tempted, but a professor's salary can't support alimony. My discovery of the cooling effect itself came quite by accident. But twice now, that accident has almost killed me. It may be argued that this is no more than I should have expected, however, since the invention which followed naturally can only be called one thing. I have invented a new weapon. That's right, a cooling gun. But let it be said that because I was once a war scientist, my inventiveness must therefore tend toward weapons, and I should be strongly tempted to reach for the nearest one available. The term war scientist has been used so much, and has grown so commonplace, that it has become universally accepted as the label for anyone who spent as little as 6 weeks in the old AEC. I was in it for 6 years, and I voluntarily walked out. The official policies and interagency politics of that era seem of little consequence now, when we have 3 permanent space satellites circling the Earth, and one of them is Russian. We're no longer in a weapons race. Both sides have reached the ultimate weapon in that contest. Nobody's hiding or betraying classified secrets anymore. There's all that silicon-rich basalt waiting to be cheaply processed out on the moon, if we can only get there. Back in '69, the official news releases were still boasting how much bigger was each new toy we rolled out of the workshop, how much more terrible destruction it would wreak than the last one. That was hogwash dished out by our PR boys, and on the other side by the Reds propaganda ministry, simply because people didn't know any better. Actually, our toys that made the biggest bang were the worst flops as weapons. You don't conquer an enemy by exterminating him. 100 million corpses are no problem, just use bulldozers and they're out of the way. But 100 million living, breathing, freezing, starving, filthy and ragged human beings can raise one hell of an uproar, and they usually do. Some of us felt that we wouldn't need to knock off even a third of Russia's major cities. Much less, in fact. Dr. Charles Whitney made the mistake of saying so, and they canned him. The scuttlebutt was that Doc's conscience backfired. I know better, I saw the explosion. It was his patience, not his conscience. Anyway, I turned in my resignation 2 weeks later. I walked out, kept my mouth shut and settled down to a small college professorship. I mention these events now simply because I believe it was there that the development of the cooling gun actually started. I had begun to see what devastating weapons could never achieve. They had deterred warfare, at least up to that August of 1969, by their threat of utter destruction, and perhaps Whitney deserved to get canned, but they offered no guarantee for the future. And they couldn't liberate a conquered nation or protect people from a dictator's secret police. It was time we had something better. We did, of course, but only a small part of the AEC was in on the development of atomic rockets. Until we did, I could sense that we were simply going through the motions. But it all began to go places fast with that cold research we were dabbling in last semester. In fact, it was my fault that General Atomics tossed that little problem into our cold lab here at Webster Tech. My own past service in the AEC, my rather unusual background combining nuclear physics and biochemistry, and the postgrad crew I've managed to accumulate under my professorial wing. The whole deal was shoveled obligingly into my Christmas stocking, and the rest of the faculty obligingly left me to play with it, providing I continued to conduct my regular classes, of course. Perhaps it's just as well I kept my hand in, though, because that line of research got rapidly nowhere. We found that materials which have their temperatures reduced to near absolute zero are just plain cold. Bring them into room temperature, and strange things happen sometimes that isn't just them trying to warm up. It isn't friction loss, and it isn't radiation damage, and it isn't entropy. It shows. There's a band of radiant energy somewhere between ultrasonics and radiant heat that hits fast and goes deep, and comes out just as fast, and it gets triggered off by whatever this is that happens with near absolute zero objects subjected to room temperature. But the whole thing is so negligible that for most practical purposes it can be ignored. Finding that out cost General Atomics $30,000, but our kids in the cold lab had a ball rigging the mad scientist's super disintegrator gizmo that reproduced the phenomenon. Then, that night, it's nearly 4 months ago now, I was alone in the lab, just switched off the lights about to close up and go home, and I stumbled over the corner of the thing. Scrambling up, somehow I put my foot into it, and reaching out to grasp its frame to steady myself, my hand hit the switch. It went on, and I went out. It was still on, I thought, when I regained consciousness, spraddled out on the concrete floor. I pulled the switch open and jerked the cord out of the wall socket. When I got home, there wasn't a bruise or a bump on my noggin, nor the faintest sign of a burn anywhere on my foot or leg or even on the sole of my shoe. That was a Tuesday night. The next day the lab remained closed, but that night I went in, switched the lights on, and studied the machine. It showed absolutely no sign of damage, no burned insulation, nothing. I stuck my hand into it and closed the switch. It came on with its usual quiet hum. Nothing happened. It was almost a week before I heard that the janitor was still wondering who'd blown all the campus fuses on Tuesday night. Then I remembered that I hadn't switched the lights back on when I regained consciousness. I had been blinded when I switched them off, had stumbled over the machine, fallen, all the rest of it. But I'd come to with night vision, naturally. I saw well enough then by the moonlight streaming in the lab windows. All the lights, the machine too, could have been off with the fuses blown without my noticing it. I had assumed the machine was on because its switch was closed, had opened the switch and jerked out the cord plug. What happened had therefore required a tremendous spurt of juice in the circuit, or else a heck of a lot less juice than we carry in our lab outlets. So I took home the prints on the rig and began making changes, which led to more changes, which resulted in some rather complicated mathematics to which we scientific chaps resort when the kind we teach in colleges just won't work out right. I got it, a very low power input, and I got more. The thing is a sort of invisible ray. It can only be emitted or broadcast as a narrow beam from the muzzle coils of a very fancy-looking electronic rig. Low power is a must. More juice not only heats up the rig and smokes insulation, but it won't shoot the beam. I tested it on the Black Tulips Biochemical Research Project 187, which I got to close up by the clock, not by the sun, last year, Project 187A, and their blossoms closed each time the beam touched them. The purple mushrooms, which fluffed their tops in radioactivity, showed no effects. It works on a simple A battery, but there's a transistor hookup that behaves like no transistor. Its molecular structure vibrates, which it shouldn't, and emits a sharp, keening note in the vicinity of E flat. A rather bulky muffler would be required, I'm afraid, to get rid of that noise. But the oddest thing, technically, is that invisible ray beam. It hasn't any of the effects of electric shock. I'll not go into the electroneurological aspects of that. Nobody could understand it except just possibly a neurologist. But the simple fact is that this ray puts a victim to sleep instantly, and it doesn't do anything else. No blockages or convulsions of nerve ganglia, not even a temporary catharsis of mild shock. Apparently it gallops up the white matter of the nervous system quite harmlessly, then smacks the grey matter, the brain, the spinal column, a good wallop, painlessly. In short, the victim just flops over and snores up a half hour or so, and then awakens as if from a short nap, though perhaps with some puzzlement. There is no injury whatsoever. Naturally, I wanted to find out how the cooling effect worked and why, though I may never learn what it is. Hypnosis? Artificially induced instantaneous sleep? Victims can be handled without awakening. Of course I was curious. I'd have gone through it step by step for my own satisfaction, even if somebody else had already done it before. Nobody had, and it wasn't easy. During the rest of the term, even through final exams, I devoted every spare moment to the cooling effect. Even so, it took another 2 months hot sweat, the summer vacation's practically gone now, to get those final diagrams onto my drawing board. But once I did, there it was, at least its basic circuits and components. All I needed was to juggle them around, coax them into a slim tubular case, put a carved butt on it containing the A battery, and give it a push-button trigger. With that data, any good bench hand in an electrical repair shop could have done the job. I fashioned it out of plastic and odds and ends in my basement laboratory. A glance in the telephone red book gave me the number of a local breeding farm, and a call soon brought a pair of fat, inquisitive guinea pigs in a small wire-screened carrying cage. Beyond the patio wall, my house sides directly on open pasturage, and beyond that, lower in the valley, the alfalfa field begins. With a brisk pacing off of a baseline and some rough splay-thumbed triangulation, I soon determined my new weapon's effectiveness from point-blank range to 1,000 yards, on guinea pigs, that is. At 900 yards, it still knocked them over for the count. At 1,000 yards, it had no effect whatever, so far as I could determine through field glasses. The animals gave no sign that they even noticed it. That, plus the nature of the mechanism, indicates its application is definitely limited. Whether you make it small enough to fit a lady's purse or as big as an atomic cannon, its maximum effective range will still remain 900 yards. And not just on guinea pigs. I already knew from my own experience what it does to a man at close range. Blowing the fuses on the whole campus had been the real danger there, however. Had it been the slightest bit different, even to the position of my foot in that big machine, I should certainly have been electrocuted that night. That was the first time it almost killed me. The cooling effect is worthless as an anesthetic for surgery. While the sleeping guinea pigs don't awaken when I pick them up out of their cage and handle them, even pulling their legs, they do struggle. They resist, like sleeping animals, not wanting to be disturbed. Still, I pinched them and bounced them, and they invariably slept through an approximate half hour. It's shock, and it isn't. It's sleep, and it isn't. But I certainly knew it was a weapon. A new weapon. And man alive, what a weapon! I turned the guinea pigs loose in the patio, let them scamper, then tumbled them both with a quick sweep of the beam. One man in ambush could knock over a whole company of marching troops. The guns could be mounted on tripods with a rotating mechanism that kept them sweeping the area constantly. Anyone who approached within 900 yards would go down, then wake up, climb back to their feet, and go down again every half hour. Man or animal. The guns could be strung out to cover a whole sector, then wired to a single main switch, and one lone observer could stop an infantry advance. But they wouldn't stop guided missiles or even mortar fire, nor would they deflect through peepholes on a tank or pillbox. There isn't quite that much scatter from the beam reflecting off a hard surface. However, there is some. I fired through the wire screen openings of the cage and had the beam glance directly off the back wall, often knocking the guinea pigs down without hitting them directly. It went through a handkerchief easily, even when folded thick. A thin glass tumbler, however, stopped it. You could take cover from it almost anywhere if you knew when you were going to be shot at. You could wear a light plastic armour if the joints were sealed and you kept it hooked to about a 50-pound air-conditioned unit. No problem at all if you ride a motor scooter. It wouldn't stop an invading army, but it could certainly raise the devil with the occupation. Almost anyone could make the gun. Given the components of a pocket radio, a few pieces of copper wire, a few sticks of chewing gum and a penknife, I could whittle one out of wood or put it into a plastic toy water pistol. But what the armed forces don't want right now is a new secret weapon. They have their manned satellite now, keeping its vigil over the arsenals of Earth, their big atomic missiles ready to jump off against preset targets, but with the frightful unknown of deep space chilling their backsides. And, too, I can imagine trying to sell those generals on something that won't even stop a tank. I'm afraid I forgot to shut off the kitchen monitor that night. The servos dished out the dinner menu I'd dialed before noon, then whisked it away when it got cold. I noticed it when the waste processor's stuttering hum went on a bit longer than usual. I realized all too clearly what a predicament I was in. The armed forces would undoubtedly suppress my invention. Their lives are nightmarish enough already, not knowing what they'll find out in space or how it will affect matters. What's more, they would suppress me. There are certain retroactive clauses in that contract I signed with the AEC which would do the job with complete legality. A nice little hideaway then, with nothing for miles but security guards, radar traps, tripwires, and electric fences. But that was the kindest fate I could expect. Quite a number of assorted big and small dictators might like my head blown off. The most obvious alternative was to suppress the invention myself, to destroy all traces of my experiments and forget about it, to convince myself the world wasn't ready for it. It's quite possible I might have, if I hadn't kept forgetting to shut off things, and if not for an unsavoury little group. There is small chance that Big Jake Claggett and his 3 henchmen will ever be remembered for their unwitting contribution to science and the future of mankind. In fact, their contribution can be accepted as the merest coincidence, unless you discount Big Jake's liking for foreign sports cars. But that came later. We always have had criminals and crime, and it just happened that Claggett's gang were the big news that day. It could as easily have been some other bunch of crooks. Anyway, when 9 p.m. rolled around, my wall TV burst into its customary serenade of sound and colour, timed for just enough of the opening commercial to let me settle down to watch Mr. Winkle's news commentary. It was August 23rd, 1979. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Big Jake Claggett and his gang robbed the Bellefontaine County Savings Bank and got away with $23,000. One of the gang clubbed the elderly bank guard senseless with the barrel of his revolver. The guard was hospitalized for a possible skull fracture. Witnesses said Big Jake cursed the gunman who struck the guard, warning him to get hold of himself. That was enough for me. The world had to be given my new weapon. I'm even more convinced of it now after discussing it with Sergeant Velasca. Practically every professional criminal in this country would give almost anything for the cooling gun. Then they could commit armed robbery with no risk of earning a murder rap. I could see that both criminals and police officers would welcome it, and for one simple reason. It doesn't kill, maim, or injure. Even if it should cause a tremendous increase in robberies and similar crimes, its victims wouldn't be dead. Better 100 robberies than one man's death. Besides, I had a notion that I could discourage its criminal use. First, I had to prevent its suppression. Solve that problem, and there wouldn't be any reason I couldn't manufacture the pistols, advertise them, and sell them exactly as any firearms company can sell .22 rifles. Except that I should probably do better to arrange for their manufacture by some established firm. That was when I began planning to write this. There is just one condition under which no secret can be suppressed, when it ceases to be a secret. It took preparation. The roughed-out diagrams and scribbled notes a man uses in research are hardly suitable for publication. Technical specifications had to be phrased in clear, understandable terms. The complete data took nearly 2 weeks to reach final draft. Also, it seemed best to establish the importance, and at least imply the probable consequences, of this publication. And then, obviously, I had to find a publisher. That one had me stumped. Furthermore, I suspect it might still have me stumped if I did not now have the full support of the governor and the state police of Ohio. These police officers want cooling guns. But even back then, while I was still the only man on Earth who knew about it, I managed to formulate a solution of sorts. Any publisher would be scared of the thing while only he and I and the printers knew about it. He'd be risking a federal injunction, at the very least, even to consider publishing it. But if it were no longer a secret and simply not yet common knowledge, most publishers would grab it. If, for example, some manufacturing firm had already considered it and was planning to put cooling guns into production. Dr. Charles Whitney is currently the president and chief stockholder of the Cleveland Atomic Equipment Company, which designs and manufactures special tools and equipment for nuclear power companies, radiation labs, and universities throughout the Midwest. He started the business after his dismissal from the AEC and built it up gradually over the ensuing 10 years. We have some of his tools at Webster Tech. Then, too, Whitney and I had maintained a cursory but friendly contact through the years, so naturally I thought of him first. He had the production layout for the job. What's more, he had the guts to go through with it. All I had to do was sell him on it. Unfortunately, by then I was scared silly. I was the furtive, sneaky little man whose invention would change the world. I contacted Dr. Whitney with a simple televisor call, but instead of suggesting a perfectly normal appointment at his office, I had to swear him to secrecy and arrange a clandestine meeting in the country. I wonder he didn't consult an almanac to see if there wasn't a full moon that night. In fact, I wonder that he came at all. It was pouring rain. At least 6 hours are still required to reach Indian Lake in dry weather, even allowing the federal freeway's 125 miles an hour speed limit. Once through the Columbus turnoff, you have to double back westward and northward through a hilly rural country with twisting country roads. You must have excellent driving ability to average more than 30 miles an hour, and it won't be much more, over that maze of roads. When they're wet, you need driving ability just to stay on them. I'd worked late the night before, arranging my material for this meeting, and didn't arise until noon. One glance at the sky's heavy overcast told me what to expect. The weather reports confirmed it. The world proceeded about its own business, of course, thoroughly indifferent to a worried man eating his belated breakfast. I was so completely alone. If I felt any sense of foreboding, stuffing articles into my pockets, picking up the guinea pig's case and going out to the car, I couldn't distinguish it from my feeling of gloom. Perhaps I did, since the world's affairs caught up with me quite forcibly that night. I met the rain before I was halfway up the freeway and had to cut speed clear down to 85. The old hotel on Indian Lake was my natural choice for a rendezvous, since it was a gutted ruin in abandoned backwoods, though abandoned isn't exactly true. Local residents still fish the lake, and there are a few homes around the shore area. Strictly speaking, the region has simply changed with the times. Today, you can't get past the toll gate onto a federal freeway unless you have a federal driver's license and your vehicle inspection sticker is up to date, which changed more things, I think, than nuclear power and industrial automation. When people suddenly couldn't drive across the country in any junk heap with a nut at the wheel, it became a mark of distinction just to live in the country. That's what made more rural jobs, the small community shopping centres springing up, products having to be shipped out to them, the growth of rural power and water systems, when work in the cities got scarce with automation taking over the factories. But it hit the small resort areas especially hard. More people are vacationing in the cities now than at the seashore or mountains. I hadn't been out to the lake in years, but I had less trouble finding my way this time than ever before. The influx of new home builders has considerably improved the road signs around there, both in number and accuracy, and that's all you need in a Porsche Apache. My little blue speedster takes those narrow, rain-slicked country roads like a Skid Row bum making the saloon circuit with a brand new $10 bill. The only real problem is getting around those armour-sided Detroit mastodons that can't decide which end is the front. Anyway, driving kept me too busy to think much of anything else. But I made good time, better than I expected, and it wasn't long after dark when my headlights cut through the sheeting rain to pick out the fire-blackened ruin of the hotel. I jounced the little Porsche around the deep-rutted drive and parked next to the empty frame building that had once been the restaurant and bar. I had plenty of time to think, for Dr. Whitney didn't arrive until 2 hours later. It was sometime during those 2 hours that the Claggett gang smashed their way through a police roadblock just outside Laumer, their guns blasting reply to the machine gun bullets peppering their big sedan. 2 policemen were seriously wounded, 1 died on the way to hospital. Shortly afterward, the bullet-riddled sedan was found by the roadside, but only one of the gang was in it. He was dead. And sometime later, a call aroused Sergeant Falaska from a sound sleep. He didn't even take time to don his state police uniform, but merely pulled a trench coat over his pyjamas, got his revolver out of the bureau drawer, and kissed his wife on the way out the front door. He had 3 other state troopers to pick up, off-duty as he was, before proceeding to the assembly point at Laumer. The Claggett gang had split up, some of them probably wounded, each of them armed and more dangerous than ever. They were wanted for murder now. Dr. Whitney made the trip by helicopter, of course. The head of a scientific instrument company must keep up appearances. He'd waited as long as he could, hoping the weather might clear, then had taken off on instruments and reached the lake by ADF grid map. He settled to the lake surface and crept into shore, his landing lights probing the thick curtains of rain. I heard the hollow roar of his turbine rather than the throb of his rotor blades, and hurried around the slanting wing of the old hotel to meet him. The lakefront presented a macabre view that wrenched at my memory. The desolate, cracked stucco walls with the black holes of their windows rising from mounds of rubble beside me, a weed-grown lawn and a straggle of trees half-masking the lake, stark-looking trees now in the copter's landing lights, and a small boat dock leaning half into the black water. Once, as a rather obnoxious young high school student, I had seen this lakefront on just such a night. A steady rain fell, lightning flickered, and thunder blasted its anger, and for a moment I saw it as it had been, with that grand old British pioneer of spaceflight, Arthur C. Clarke, standing out there in the pelting rain with his camera, taking pictures of the lightning. Dr. Whitney brought his sleek craft over the treetops and settled neatly into the small space that remained of the lawn, his rotor tips almost nicking the crumbled walls of the hotel. It was a plexi-nosed, 3-place executive ship, a Bell, I think. A lot of people prefer flying. They must fly specific air routes and airfield traffic patterns, and with airfields so crowded they have trouble finding a place to park. It's not for me. But Dr. Whitney had heard the newscasts on the way out. I don't recall what was said at our meeting. It was rather uncomfortable under the circumstances, the more so for me, I think, as those circumstances were my own making. But when we'd rounded the hotel and entered the old restaurant bar, I recalled Whitney's jocular approval. "Well, we're cosy enough here," he said, "so long as the Claggett gang doesn't drop in on us." That was how I heard of the night's happenings. When he saw that his remark puzzled me, he related the news while I was setting things up for our conference. We were in the back room, which had once been the bar. The front section, formerly the restaurant, had had windows all around which now formed an unbroken gap with a chill wind whistling through it. The place was stripped bare of its former fixtures, but some unsung fisherman had provided the old barroom with a rickety table and several pressed board boxes to sit on. I had a Coleman radiant heat lantern which I swung from a ceiling wire hook, a plastic sheet which I threw across the table, and a couple of patio chair cushions for the boxes. It took some shifting about to get everything out of the way of several roof leaks, and I had to choose a sturdy box for myself, first testing a few. I can well imagine the thoughts and emotions struggling through Dr. Whitney's mind then, but he showed none of them. It was I, rather, with my clumsy movements, the pauses to polish my glasses, the lump I kept trying to swallow, who took so long to face up to it. But finally, we were ready. I took out my notebook and opened it upon the table before me. Whitney's frosty eyebrows raised. Then he quietly reached inside his own topcoat, produced his notebook and pen, and laid the notebook open before him. It was a gesture of an almost forgotten past, but a habit neither of us had ever abandoned. Something about it, the reminder of countless AEC conferences we had both attended, had a steadying effect on me. I placed my pistol in the centre of the table. The guinea pig's cage was on the floor before us. I told what I had to tell. Then I went to the cage, removed one of the animals and tucked it into my pocket. Returning to the table, I picked up the pistol and fired at the cage. The shrill E-flat note pierced the rushing sound of the rain. Whitney rose and went to the cage. Gently removing the little creature, he felt it a moment, then nodded. "Asleep," he said, and replaced it in the cage. Looking over my notes, I see that considerable space would be required to cover the entire interrogation which followed. Also, I see that I failed to note down the almost gradual change in my old friend's demeanour, from his calm, quiet manner at first to the keen-eyed excitement of his flushed features, his rapid-fire questions at the end. I shall instead give some examples of that discussion. "The guinea pigs sleep for only a half hour? Always a half hour?" "Yes, it never varies much, a minute or so each way." "If you, shoot one, then shoot it again, does that prolong its sleep any?" "Not at all. Still only a half hour, no matter how many times you shoot them while they sleep." That could indicate sleep is the brain's defense mechanism against the effect of your ray. A successful defense, it would seem. They show no after effects of this." "None whatever. They've begun to associate it with the pistol, though. Each time I point the pistol at them, they get mad." "You mean angry? They aren't afraid of it?" "Certainly not afraid. One in my pocket here tries burrowing into corners, making furious grunting sounds. The other one usually just stands and glares at me." "How about when they wake up?" "Well, generally their first reaction is to keep a sharp eye out for me and the pistol." "Wary, eh? Damned inconvenient, I suppose, getting knocked asleep all the time. But it certainly doesn't seem to hurt them. What about mental disturbance?" "No obvious aberrations, but I don't know. Yes, they're only guinea pigs. Hardly be satisfactory to the American Medical Association, among others. Take years of research to determine its absolute safety, but it should be released to the public now." "Why?" "Because its harmful effects, if any, are very likely to be insignificant, or we'd have no doubts about their existence." "That assumption could be dangerous." "Yes, but there's something else too. This new weapon will replace firearms, which certainly do inflict injury, even death." "Ah, society's application of it." And Dr. Whitney took several minutes to digest that aspect. I outlined my plans to him. He was incredulous at first, then frankly aghast. "You expect me to mass-produce that thing?" I said I hoped he would. He then commenced raking me over the coals in a most fitting and proper manner. Didn't I realize what I had created? My visions of it freeing peoples from police-state enslavement were all fine and good, and it might conceivably have such result, but what I had here was nothing more than the most fiendish instrument ever inflicted upon human society. What did I think it might do in the hands of muggers, sex offenders, pickpockets, burglars, or worse? Why, our whole civilized culture would be thrown into chaos. No person would dare ever be alone for fear of ambush. No one could sleep without someone else standing watch. No man could defend his own possessions. No woman could keep her chastity unless people were around them, watching them every moment of their lives. Goods could no longer be transported without heavy guard. The wealthy, who could afford it, would have to live in massive, well-guarded fortresses. The rest of us would be like the feudal serf with nothing worth stealing and quite accustomed to having his daughters raped. We'd be thrown back into the Dark Ages." I nodded agreement to everything he said. Then I took the guinea pig from my pocket, held it squirming, and fastened a little collar about its neck. I unwound a wire from the plastic disc on the collar so Dr. Whitney could see it. He instantly recognized the tiny node on the wire as a miniature microphone. "Remember how you determined that the other pig was asleep?" I asked. I taped the tiny node to the artery on the pig's neck, carried it over to the cage, and placed it inside. "I call this my Hey Rube," I explained, grinning. "But imagine it as a little wrist radio transmitter, worn by everyone who requests them, tuned to the police broadcast frequency. Radio DF could pinpoint the location in seconds." Going back to the table, I picked up the pistol. "This one's just for demonstration," I added, and fired at the cage. As the guinea pig slumped beside its companion, the disc on its collar emitted a harsh buzzing noise. Whitney chuckled. "Slowed heartbeat, eh? Simple as that." "And better than any burglar alarm," I pointed out. "This one needn't sit still while some crook disconnects it." He pointed out, of course, that this might destroy its usefulness to people in a police state. The dictator's police and troops could wear Hey Rube radios too. I replied that all the people's underground fighters would need is a cooling pistol and a saw-edged meat knife. One man could knock over a whole platoon and cut their heel tendons in minutes. "The American Indians used to collect scalps in less time," I said, "but a wounded man's more trouble to the enemy than a dead one. I think the heel tendon would be easiest." Perhaps it was a bit out of character for me. Whitney looked at me for a long moment and blinked, both eyes tight. But still, he didn't think much of my plans. His subsequent suggestions were far more rational, however, than the ones I had evolved through fear. First, we didn't really know the armed forces would suppress this gun. They were completely involved in their problems of spaceflight and military satellites. There probably wasn't anyone left in Washington who was even looking for secret weapons now. And we just might get this gun through while they weren't looking. He suggested, therefore, that I attempt to patent my invention, but that we should take adequate safeguards. I must handle all patent correspondence through his office. Then, if the armed forces clamped down, they'd come there first, and he could tip me off in time to escape. I'd have to flee the country, but at least I'd be free and we could adopt other measures for bringing out the gun. It would be pointless now to disclose what other plans and arrangements we made. It's enough to say I agreed. The discussion then turned to further speculation of what the future might be with the cooling gun. Whitney was not at all convinced it would be good, but rather that neither we nor any group of men had the right to decide what humanity should or should not do. He had strong doubts that it would mean the end of dictatorship. Dictators dream world conquest, and dreams like that breed war, he said. But they aren't the only ones to blame. You'll find people who like dictatorships. But the truth was that most of humanity didn't want to get involved, never realizing that that involved them more than anything else could. It was at approximately this time, so far as I can determine, that Big Jake Claggett and one of his henchmen walked up to a service station where a Porsche Speedster was getting gas. They clubbed the station attendant unconscious, hauled the driver out of the little sports car, and took off in it. Dr. Whitney left me with a problem. What could be done to keep people alert? It is this one thing that will determine the cooling gun's effect on the world, whether as an instrument of crime or protection for the weak, the innocent. Where people are complacent, it will be a boon to thieves and revolutionaries. Where people are alert. But what could keep us alert? Driving back, I was preoccupied, hardly conscious of the little car's deft progress over the slick roads. It was almost with a feeling of detached interest that I saw the black skid marks at the bottom of the hill, then, with chill shock, the dark bulk of the sedan on its side in the ditch. I was slowing when a flashlight beam raked outward from the car, showing crumpled metal and broken headlights. One figure, perhaps two, was standing behind it. Another one, a man in a trench coat, mud-splattered almost to his hips, was walking onto the road in front of me, flagging me down. "Get out of that car!" There were exasperation and rage in his voice, an expression of utter fury on his face. He stood just at the edge of my headlight's glare, not directly in it, with his hands thrust deep in his pockets. There was that. There was the speed of the sedan, as evidenced by its skid marks. My mind leaped instantly to one nerve-shattering conclusion. And I felt absolutely calm. I can't explain that. It may have been that the night's events had already drained me of tense emotion. They're armed, I thought. But so am I, and I have a weapon that can get them all with one sweep. This while I opened the door and climbed out, while I thrust my hand into my own pocket. I whipped out the little pistol. One instant he was standing still, hands thrust in the wet trench coat. The next a heavy revolver exploded at his hip. A sledgehammer caught me in the right side, knocked me reeling. It occurred to me then, lying there on the road, cold rain pelting my face, a warm wetness spreading along my side. I had met the one pitfall we shall never escape in a pistol-packing society. The man who's faster with a gun than you are. Bending over me, Sergeant Nicholas Valaska picked up the little plastic cooling gun and straightened up, peering at it, scowling. "What the hell?" he muttered. I was rather inclined to agree. Naturally, this had to be told. The state of Ohio wants cooling guns for its police officers. After this, other states will undoubtedly follow suit. The armed forces don't want to suppress it, and Dr. Whitney will start production in just another week. They've been very decent about paying my hospital bills and seeing that nothing else happens to me. Even though Sergeant Valaska was saddled with the latter responsibility, I must repeat that he's treated me very well. The future will depend a lot on men like him. As for the rest, I've been assured that the guinea pigs were honourably retired to the breeding farm. Nurse wouldn't let me keep them here. Everyone knows of the violent end of the Claggett gang. I want to state vigorously at this point, despite widespread public belief, neither I nor the cooling gun had anything whatsoever to do with it. I never at any time even saw Claggett or any member of his gang. Their unwitting contribution was the alerting of Sergeant Valaska and the rest of the police, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this account, Claggett stealing a Porsche like mine because he was fond of sports cars. That's the whole of the story, except for one additional item. This is scheduled to appear at the same time as the plans and specifications for the cooling gun. You'll find them given as premiums with safety razors, breakfast cereals, cigarettes and other articles. I wish to thank the manufacturers for their kind cooperation. Puppet Government by George Revelle. Narrated by William Skye. Year after year they came back, despite his constant refusals, and still Brandon couldn't figure out why he was so important. Brandon was looking at his desk again. An artificial grin spread across the narrow face of the Secretary of Interior, who was watching him closely. The Secretary's pencil-thin fingers continued to toy with the small wood figure he was holding. "Brandon," he tried to lie gracefully, "you're a card. A real card." Brandon shifted his position, brought his attention back to the thin man with the receding hairline. He couldn't for the life of him remember anything humorous he had said or done. He was too tired to be jovial. The past few days had sapped his strength. He was exhausted, and there were still 2 more interviews scheduled. Good Lord, he thought, 2 more! He found his eyes wandering back to his desk. He would never finish the papers in time. That would mean a severe penalty. "Come now, Brandon. Admit it. You know you want to work for us in Interior." "Right now I don't know anything," Brandon said wearily. "My head is tired and clouded. I can't think straight." He rubbed his hand across his forehead, wondering how much longer he would be able to continue to say no to their requests. He had almost found himself agreeing with the thin man a few moments ago. That wasn't good. Brandon leaned back in the contour chair and let some of the strength seep back into his outstretched legs. Each year at this time they would begin to wander in with their strange, outlandish offers of positions with the government. It was perplexing. "Why me?" he asked suddenly. "Why in Interior? I know nothing about such work." The thin man leaned forward. "Because you are a good man, Brandon, and we need good men these days. Government is big business, and we want the top positions filled with the best men we can get. Besides," the secretary laughed softly, "you're wasting your time playing with dolls." "They aren't dolls," Brandon said indignantly. "So they aren't dolls." "There is a difference," Brandon insisted. "You make it sound as if I'm in my second childhood." "All right, puppets." The thin man shifted in his chair. He ran his lean fingers over the hand-painted figure he was holding in one hand. "But you can see my point." Brandon shook his head. That was it. He couldn't see the point. His puppets were becoming world famous, the result of reviving the almost lost art of hand carving. He was earning a fair living at it. He could see no reason for a change. "Think of the prestige if you come with us. You will be heading a department of your own," the secretary said. Brandon wrinkled his brow, thinking of how his name was already associated with his puppets. If only they would leave him alone, if only there wasn't so much paperwork waiting for him on his desk, he would be able to spread out, expand, really have a going business. But they had to keep pestering him with worthless offers that they knew he couldn't handle, wasting his time, especially now when time was of the essence. The paperwork on his desk had to be completed by midnight. He would never finish it now. Brandon felt the beginning of a headache. Because of the paperwork, he hadn't had time to touch a new puppet in months. Now these damn interviews were keeping him from the desk work. It was a vicious circle leading to ruin. "You will be serving your country, Brandon," the secretary said strongly. "Not fiddling with dolls." "I told you," the secretary held up his hand. "I know. Puppets." Brandon got up and walked to the window and looked out at the setting sun. It was hard to define. There were some things words couldn't explain. All the offers had been good ones. But a man had to have some rule, some yardstick to guide him. Brandon had his. He wanted to be useful. That wasn't too much to ask. Life was too short to waste labouring in a position he wasn't fitted for. If he took Interior's offer, all that would be ended. He would be caught in a web which allowed no escape. Brandon turned. "I'm afraid, Mr. Secretary, that you don't understand my position. It isn't that I feel above being employed by the President. I have all the respect in the world for him and his office. I have nothing but respect for you." "Then what is it, Brandon?" "I don't think I would be happy taking orders from someone else." "We all have a boss, Brandon." "I haven't." The secretary grinned. "You can head your own department. The President and myself will be the only ones you will have to answer to, I promise." "That's what I mean," Brandon answered softly. The secretary felt his face flush. "You are insinuating that you are above working for the President, Mr. Brandon," he said stiffly. "You're twisting words," Brandon's voice was determined. "It's just that I like to work alone. I like to put my hat on and go whenever and wherever I please." The secretary shook his head. "Brandon, I happen to know that you haven't been off this estate, this property of yours, in the past 5 years. That doesn't alter a thing. I can go any time I please. I have no reason to leave now, but when I do, I won't feel obligated. I won't have to ask permission." The secretary relaxed. "You can do that in the department any time you wish. Visit the conservations, then, when you are tired of traipsing around, you can come back and write up a report or two." The secretary cleared his throat. "Just for the records, of course." Brandon sighed. "Of course, just for the records." He brushed back his thick black hair and sat down. Damn it, why wouldn't they leave him alone? That was all he wanted, to be left alone. He was sick of all this. They knew he wasn't fitted to be a clerk in any of the departments, yet they wasted his time offering him important positions, as if the title would persuade him. Why? "We could outlaw your doll-making," the secretary said casually. Brandon shrugged his shoulders. "Harmonix did that with my music writing, remember? I didn't always do hand-carving." The secretary remembered. He had had an indirect hand in that. It had been thought that if Brandon was suddenly without income, he might easily be persuaded to accept a position. They hadn't counted on Brandon's resourcefulness, nor his stubbornness. The thin man leaned back in his chair, looked again at the doll thing resting in one hand. The man was clever. There was a lifelike quality to the doll. Brandon was an artist, and it would be a shame to take him out of circulation. Yet what could he do? The President had insisted on the visit again this year, knowing full well that Brandon would turn down the offer. Suddenly the secretary felt sorry for Brandon. The man was breaking down and didn't realize it. His face was drawn and pale. He looked dog-tired. "Won't you change your mind, Brandon?" the secretary asked softly. "With Interior, you will have an opportunity to get out into the sunlight. It will be a healthy life visiting the many conservations we have situated around the country. It will agree with you, I'm sure." Brandon sighed. "I'm afraid, Mr. Secretary, that we are both wasting our time. I have a tremendous amount of paperwork to finish before midnight tonight, and I am tired. I also have a few more interviews before I can get at it." Brandon got up. "So, if you don't mind—" The thin man looked at Brandon searchingly. "Won't you reconsider?" "I'm afraid not," Brandon answered. The secretary paused at the door. "See you next year, then." "Next year," Brandon answered flatly. The Secretary of Interior hardly spoke to the young man waiting by his vehicle. He wanted to get away from there as soon as possible. These yearly visits to Brandon always upset him, made him feel like a cad. It would be days before he shook the unwanted feeling. "How did it go?" the young man asked eagerly. The secretary took in the youngish face, the confidence flowing from the eyes. Evans always managed to give that youthful impression, yet he wasn't really a young man. In a way, the thin man envied Evans, with one exception, of course. This would be Evans's first visit to Brandon. Some of the confidence would be gone when he walked out of Brandon's house. "I said, how did it go?" Evans repeated. The secretary shrugged his thin shoulders. "As usual, he refused." Evans showed white, even teeth. "Is he tired?" "Very." "Excellent," Evans said. "And the paperwork, is it worrying him?" The thin man studied Evans. No, he didn't envy the man any longer. Evans had no feelings. It was written on his face. "The paperwork is worrying him to death," he heard himself say. "Wonderful!" The secretary became conscious of the small figure he was holding in his hand. He had walked out with one of Brandon's creations. Suddenly, he slammed it to the ground. The paint chipped and cracked. The small head rolled loosely across the lawn. Evans looked at him queerly. "I think you need a rest," the young man said softly, unsmiling. "Brandon is a good man. I hate to see him broken. He has a lot of talent, but not for the work we're offering him. It isn't right grinding him into the dirt the way we are." Evans leaned over, picked up the broken puppet. One arm was twisted at an odd angle. The clown suit was torn and dirty. Evans tried to fit the head back on the small body. Finally, he succeeded. He looked at the Secretary of Interior. His eyes seemed different. "I have a position he can fill and do a good job. He won't refuse, I'm sure." Evans walked away toward Brandon's house, still holding the broken figure. Brandon stood on the veranda looking across his small estate in the direction of the city. The site of the government was located there. Perhaps that was why he was so reluctant. He lived too close to it, had it around him day in and day out. The government was ubiquitous, omnipresent and omnipotent. It dominated every conversation, every business, every life from birth to death. Lately it seemed that everyone he came in contact with held a position with some agency connected with the government. "Mr. Brandon." "I know," he answered without turning. "You're from Labour." "We've never met." Brandon turned and took in the lean individual who called himself Evans. Quite different from the one who had called last year. That one had been old and grumpy. Brandon's lips parted. "I assumed. All the other departments have been here except Revenue. I didn't see Wilson standing outside. I've heard he's out of the country. That leaves you." "You could have been wrong, you know," Evans said. "How?" Brandon asked without fully caring. "Revenue has been split. There are 2 departments now, Revenue and Taxation. Taxation handles income from taxpayers only." "Big deal," Brandon said harshly, remembering his desk piled high with papers. "They say you are a stubborn man, Brandon." "Stubborn?" "Quite." "Let's say I'm content with my lot." "Are you really, Brandon?" Brandon took in the young man's wide shoulders, the face that was almost too young for such a responsible position. For just an instant, he had felt that this man would be different, that there might be a challenge here. He could see he was wrong. The man was going to offer him a position. "Let's get to the point," he said hurriedly. "I'm happy making puppets and I feel no use for a change." "I'm glad you are happy, Mr. Brandon." "Good. Then there is no need to continue. I refuse your offer." Brandon was getting irritated. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked past Evans into the house. He stood by his desk. The pile of papers was still resting there, waiting for him. He had hoped in some magical way that they might have vanished. A foolish thought, he knew. "Income tax," he heard Evans say from his shoulder. Brandon nodded wearily. Evans reached over and picked up a form. He frowned. "Complicated." "Each year it gets worse," Brandon said listlessly. "I've never had to file one," Evans said. Brandon lifted one eyebrow. "Government employees never do. We are paid a flat sum, and our subsistence is taken care of. Calculators and computers adjust our salary each year in proportion to the expense of the government. We have been operating out of the red that way for years. It works out fine. Brandon ran his hands through the papers and forms. Why then did he have to wade through this mess each year when it could be made so simple? He had been staggering under the load. You're an independent, Brandon, Evans said. You stay in business for yourself because you dislike working for someone else. Isn't that right? You might say that. Evans dangled a handful of papers in front of Brandon's brown eyes. You are working for someone else now. The tax department. Not exactly. I don't have to answer to anyone, Evans snorted. Not even the tax collector? Not unless I make an error, Brandon said stubbornly. And I won't. I'm becoming an expert on this. When a man spends 100 days a year working on these damn things, he learns quite a bit. There will be no errors. 100 days, Evans laughed. Soon it'll be every day of the year. Then where will you be? He looked directly into Brandon's eyes. Can't you see? You're in the web already, working a third of the year without compensation. Evans pulled from his pocket the broken puppet he had picked up from the driveway outside Brandon's house. He laid it in front of Brandon on the pile of income tax blanks. Soon you'll be without income. Your business will deteriorate from lack of attention. Brandon said nothing. Evans moved to the contour chair and sat down. He closed his eyes. You've been out of circulation a long time, Brandon. The world is changing. Government is big business, one of the largest, and it's expanding. We need more men, good men. Evans opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. You said you've become an expert on forms. Would you consider taking a position as head of the tax department? He asked abruptly. Brandon lifted his gaze from the desk. I thought you were with Labour. I could arrange it. Evans closed his eyes again. But think, Brandon. As chief of the bureau, you won't have to answer to anyone, not even the president. You've seen the mess the forms have become. You can straighten it out. I don't think... I'll have to put it in writing that no one will bother you. Brandon stared at the papers on his desk. For the first time, they were offering him a position he understood, one he could handle. It would be a challenge. He would be in a position to eliminate 3/4 of that damn paperwork. God knew how many like himself were gradually getting snowed under each year. Brandon played with the puppet. The silly face stared back at him with a fixed, smiling expression. Tell me, Evans, he asked idly, why so much effort to locate me in a government position? I've had no special training. This is the first offer I'm even qualified enough to accept. He lifted the puppet face high, gazed at its face. For 10 years I've been pestered. Evans laughed as he pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket. You have determination and willpower. We need that type of nature these days more than ever. Evans's smile became wide. And you will be one less taxpayer we will have to worry about now. You'll be on our side. Evans pushed all the forms from Brandon's desk with a sweep of his tanned hand. Forget all of that, Brandon, forever. No more taxes for you. This is the last form you will have to sign. It appoints you Secretary of Taxation, carte blanche. You had this all prepared? Brandon said in amazement. Evans's smile grew wider. We knew you couldn't refuse an intelligent offer, one where you would be useful. We? The cabinet and myself. Brandon picked up the pen, twisted it between his fingers. Evans was right, of course. He would be useful. Half those damn forms were filled with worthless nonsense that could easily be eliminated. Deductions should be higher. Small independent business should be given a break. And he could handle the job. That was important. Just sign on the bottom line, Evans said smoothly, pushing the broken puppet out of the way. The puppet fell to the floor, and the head came off again. Forget it, Evans said quickly. Brandon studied the other man's face before he reached over and picked up the little figure. It was a funny creature, with a large, silly-looking balloon nose. Brandon handled it tenderly, looking at it thoughtfully. Finally, he said, My puppets, what happens to them? I don't understand. Children enjoy them, Brandon answered. I'm afraid you don't understand, Brandon. Evans shook his head. I'm offering you a full-time position. You can make them, as a hobby of course, give them away, but you can't sell them. That would give you an income again, mean more tax forms. But I couldn't hope to produce them for nothing, Brandon insisted. Not on a large scale, not on the fixed salary that you mentioned. They aren't important, Brandon. Brandon's lips became a firm, straight line. For the first time, it was clear to him why he had been so reluctant to give up his work. His music had pleased people, just as his puppets were doing now. He was getting satisfaction out of his work. He was giving people something no one else seemed to be able to give them. Accepting a position he couldn't handle, working for someone else, had nothing to do with it. I've changed my mind, he said quietly. Changed your mind? Evans stared at the pen Brandon had carefully laid down on the desk, disbelief disfiguring his face. You intend fighting that each year? He pointed at the mad array of papers he had strewn at Brandon's feet. You're willing to risk not having any time at all to work on your puppets against security and a life of ease? I'm willing, Brandon answered. Now, I think you'd better leave, Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans. I might be able to finish these damn things before the midnight deadline. Evans opened his mouth, but Brandon was already showing him the way to the door, shoving something in his hand. Evans climbed into his car and slumped down on the seat beside the president. He looked at the new puppet Brandon had forced into his hand before he could refuse. Is Brandon Secretary of Taxation? The president asked, hopefully. Evans shook his head from side to side. What had gone wrong? They had known Brandon was a stubborn man. That was why things were done as they were. The offering of worthless positions had been a feint. He should have grabbed at something he could handle. And the tax forms. That was supposed to be the last straw. They had been loaded, prepared just for Brandon to break his resistance. Yet they had failed. Why? Did he suspect? The president eyed Evans. I don't think so, sir, Evans said. I had the pen in his hand. He was ready to sign. Then something went wrong. I can't understand it. The president looked the other way, found his eyes fastened on his own reflection on the window. The cabinet had been wrong thinking it was a job for a psychologist like Evans. Brandon was an individual, a decided rarity in this day and age. I'm glad, the president said softly to the glass. What was that, sir? The president turned. I said I'm glad he didn't sign. You can't mean that, sir. But I do. Do you realize what this means? Brandon was the last taxpayer. We've been forced to operate an entire bureau just to process his forms. It's the only department operating in the red. He's the only person not employed by the government, the only one still operating a private business. Evans found himself clenching the puppet tightly in his fist. We will break him. I know we will. Next year it will take him 365 days to compute his tax. I promise. Next year, the president said firmly, Brandon will get a short form. One that he can complete in 10 minutes. Do you understand, Evans? Evans's forehead creased. I'm afraid... The president looked back at his reflection on the glass. We don't want to make the boss angry now, do we, Evans? The boss, sir? Brandon, of course, the president smiled. After all, the government works for the taxpayers, Evans, and Brandon is the last taxpayer. He's our boss, son. The only boss we have left. Mr. President, if I might... The president returned his gaze to Evans. I think we've forgotten something over these past years, Evans. Something very important. What is that, sir? The president removed the puppet from Evans's limp fingers. If the sole purpose of the government is to serve the taxpayers, and there were no more, how could we justify our existence in office? The president ran his finger under the chin of the little puppet. Do you mind if I keep this, Evans? He asked softly. I'd like to take it home to my granddaughter. She's never seen a puppet. I'm sure she'll love it. The tiny figure seemed to smile approvingly. If you're enjoying the stories, support the channel by hitting the like button. Thanks. Retief of the Red Tape Mountain by Keith Laumer. Narrated by William Skye. Retief knew the importance of sealed orders, and the need to keep them that way. It's true, Consul Paswin said. I requested assignment as principal officer at a small post. But I had in mind one of those charming resort worlds with only an occasional visa problem or perhaps a distressed spaceman or two a year. Instead, I'm zookeeper to these confounded settlers. And not for one world, mind you, but 8. He stared glumly at Vice-Consul Retief. Still, Retief said, it gives an opportunity to travel. Travel? The consul barked. I hate travel. Here in this backwater system particularly. He paused, blinked at Retief and cleared his throat. Not that a bit of travel isn't an excellent thing for a junior officer. Marvellous experience. He turned to the wall screen and pressed a button. A system triagram appeared, 8 luminous green dots arranged around a larger disk representing the primary. He picked up a pointer, indicating the innermost planet. The situation on Adobe is nearing crisis. The confounded settlers, a mere handful of them, have managed, as usual, to stir up trouble with an intelligent indigenous life form, the Jack. I can't think why they bother, merely for a few oases among the endless deserts. However, I have, at last, received authorization from Sector Headquarters to take certain action. He swung back to face Retief. I'm sending you in to handle the situation, Retief, under sealed orders. He picked up a fat buff envelope. A pity they didn't see fit to order the terrestrial settlers out weeks ago, as I suggested. Now it is too late. I'm expected to produce a miracle, a rapprochement between terrestrial and Adoban, and a division of territory. It's idiotic. However, failure would look very bad in my record, so I shall expect results. He passed the buff envelope across to Retief. I understood that Adobe was uninhabited, Retief said, until the terrestrial settlers arrived. Apparently that was an erroneous impression. Paswin fixed Retief with a watery eye. You'll follow your instructions to the letter. In a delicate situation such as this, there must be no impulsive impromptu element introduced. This approach has been worked out in detail at Sector. You need merely implement it. Is that entirely clear? Has anyone at headquarters ever visited Adobe? Of course not. They all hate travel. If there are no other questions, you'd best be on your way. The mail run departs the dome in less than an hour. What's this native life form like? Retief asked, getting to his feet. When you get back, said Paswin, you tell me. The male pilot, a leathery veteran with quarter-inch whiskers, spat toward a stained corner of the compartment, leaned close to the screen. There's shooting going on down there, he said. See them white puffs over the edge of the desert? I'm supposed to be preventing the war, said Retief. It looks like I'm a little late. The pilot's head snapped around. War? He yelped. Nobody told me there was a war going on Dobie. If that's what that is, I'm getting out of here. Hold on, said Retief. I've got to get down. They won't shoot at you. They sure won't, Sonny. I ain't giving 'em the chance. He started punching keys on the console. Retief reached out, caught his wrist. Maybe you didn't hear me. I said I've got to get down. The pilot plunged against the restraint, swung a punch that Retief blocked casually. Are you nuts? The pilot screeched. There's plenty shooting going on for me to see at 50 miles out. The mail must go through, you know. Okay, you're so dead set on getting killed, you take the skiff. I'll tell him to pick up the remains next trip. You're a pal. I'll take your offer. The pilot jumped to the lifeboat hatch and cycled it open. Get in. We're closing fast. Them birds might take it into their heads to lob one this way. Retief crawled into the narrow cockpit of the skiff, glanced over the controls. The pilot ducked out of sight, came back, handed Retief a heavy old-fashioned power pistol. Long as you're going in, might as well take this. Thanks. Retief shoved the pistol in his belt. I hope you're wrong. I'll see they pick you up when the shooting's over, one way or another. The hatch clanked shut. A moment later there was a jar as the skiff dropped away, followed by heavy buffeting in the backwash from the departing mail boat. Retief watched the tiny screen, hands on the manual controls. He was dropping rapidly. 40 miles, 39... A crimson blip showed on the screen, moving out. Retief felt sweat pop out on his forehead. The red blip meant heavy radiation from a warhead. Somebody was playing around with an outlawed but by no means unheard of fission weapon. But maybe it was just on a high trajectory and had no connection with the skiff. Retief altered course to the south. The blip followed. He checked instrument readings, gripped the controls, watching. This was going to be tricky. The missile bored closer. At 5 miles, Retief threw the light skiff into maximum acceleration, straight toward the oncoming bomb. Crushed back in the padded seat, he watched the screen, correcting course minutely. The proximity fuse should be set for no more than 1,000 yards. At a combined speed of 2 miles per second, the skiff flashed past the missile, and Retief was slammed violently against the restraining harness in the concussion of the explosion, a mile astern, and harmless. Then the planetary surface was rushing up with frightening speed. Retief shook his head, kicked in the emergency retro drive. Points of light arced up from the planet face below. If they were ordinary chemical warheads, the skiff's meteor screen should handle them. The screen flashed brilliant white, then went dark. The skiff flipped on its back. Smoke filled the tiny compartment. There was a series of shocks, a final bone-shaking concussion, then stillness, broken by the ping of hot metal contracting. Coughing, Retief disengaged himself from the shock webbing. He beat out sparks in his lap, groped underfoot for the hatch, and wrenched it open. A wave of hot jungle air struck him. He lowered himself to a bed of shattered foliage, got to his feet, and dropped flat as a bullet whined past his ear. He lay listening. Stealthy movements were audible from the left. He inched his way to the shelter of a broad-boled dwarf tree. Somewhere a song lizard burbled. Whining insects circled, scented alien life, buzzed off. There was another rustle of foliage from the underbrush 5 yards away. A bush quivered, then a low bough dipped. Retief edged back around the trunk, eased down behind a fallen log. A stocky man in grimy leather shirt and shorts appeared, moving cautiously, a pistol in his hand. As he passed, Retief rose, leaped the log, and tackled him. They went down together. The stranger gave one short yell, then struggled in silence. Retief flipped him onto his back, raised a fist. "Hey!" the settler yelled. "You're as human as I am!" "Maybe I'll look better after a shave," said Retief. "What's the idea of shooting at me?" "Let me up. My name's Potter." "Sorry about that. I figured it was a flapjack boat. Looks just like 'em. I took a shot when I saw something move. Didn't know it was a terrestrial. Who are you? What are you doing here? We're pretty close to the edge of the oases. That's flapjack country over there." He waved a hand toward the north, where the desert lay. "I'm glad you're a poor shot. That missile was too close for comfort." "Missile, eh? Must be flapjack artillery. We got nothing like that." "I heard there was a full-fledged war brewing," said Retief. "I didn't expect—" "Good," Potter said. "We figured a few of you boys from Ivory would be joining up when you heard. You are from Ivory?" "Yes, Hey, you must be Lemuel's cousin. Good night. I pretty near made a bad mistake. Lemuel's a tough man to explain something to. Keep your head down. These damn flapjacks have got some wicked hand weapons. Come on." He moved off silently on all fours. Retief followed. They crossed 200 yards of rough country before Potter got to his feet, took out a soggy bandana and mopped his face. "You move good for a city man. I thought you folks on Ivory just sat under those domes and read dials. But I guess being Lemuel's cousin you was raised different. As a matter of fact, I have to get you some real clothes though. Those city duds don't stand up on Dobie." Retief looked down at the charred, torn and sweat-soaked powder blue blazer and slacks. "This outfit seemed pretty rough and ready back home," he said, "but I guess leather has its points. Let's get on back to camp. We'll just about make it by sundown. And look, don't say anything to Lemuel about me thinking you were a flapjack." "I won't, but—" Potter was on his way, loping off up a gentle slope. Retief pulled off the sodden blazer, dropped it over a bush, added his string tie, and followed Potter. "We're damn glad you're here, mister," said a fat man with 2 revolvers belted across his paunch. "We can use every hand. We're in bad shape. We ran into the flapjacks 3 months ago, and we haven't made a smart move since. First, we thought they were a native form we hadn't run into before. Fact is, one of the boys shot one, thinking it was fair game. I guess that was the start of it." He stirred the fire, added a stick. "And then a bunch of 'em hit Swayze's farm here," Potter said. "Killed 2 of his cattle and pulled back." "I figure they thought the cows were people," said Swayze. "They were out for revenge." "How could anybody think a cow was folks?" another man put in. "They don't look nothing like—" "Don't be so dumb, Bert," said Swayze. "They'd never seen Terrys before. They know better now." Bert chuckled. "Sure do. We showed 'em the next time, didn't we, Potter? Got 4. "They walked right up to my place a couple days after the first time," Swayze said. "We were ready for 'em. Peppered 'em good. They cut and run." "Flopped, you mean? Ugliest looking critters you ever saw. Looks just like a old piece of dirty blanket humping around." "It's been going on this way ever since. They raid and then we raid. But lately they've been bringing some big stuff into it. Now they've got some kind of pint-sized airships and automatic rifles. We've lost 4 men now, and a dozen more in the freezer, waiting for the medship. We can't afford it. The colony's got less than 300 able-bodied men." "But we're hanging on to our farms," said Potter. "All these oases are old seabeds, a mile deep, solid topsoil. And there's a couple of 100 others we haven't touched yet. The flapjacks won't get 'em while there's a man alive." "The whole system needs the food we can raise," Bert said. "These farms we're trying to start won't be enough, but they'll help." "We've been yelling for help to the CDT over on Ivory," said Potter. "But you know, these embassy stooges." "We heard they were sending some kind of bureaucrat in here to tell us to get out and give the oases to the flapjacks," said Swayze. He tightened his mouth. "We're waiting for him." "Meanwhile, we got reinforcements coming up, eh, boys?" Bert winked at Retief. "We put out the word back home. We all got relatives on Ivory and Verd." "Shut up, you damn fool," a deep voice grated. "Lemuel," Potter said. "Nobody else could sneak up on us like that." "If I'd have been a flapjack, I'd have ate you alive," the newcomer said, moving into the ring of fire, a tall, broad-faced man in grimy leather. He eyed Retief. "Who's that?"
"What do you mean?"
Potter spoke in the silence.
"He's your cousin."
"He ain't no cousin of mine," Lemuel said slowly. He stepped to Retief. "Who you spying for, stranger?" he rasped. Retief got to his feet.
"I think I should explain."
A short-nosed automatic appeared in Lemuel's hand, a clashing note against his fringed buckskins. "Skip the talk. I know a fink when I see one."
"Just for a change, I'd like to finish a sentence," said Retief. "And I suggest you put your courage back in your pocket before it bites you."
"You talk too damned fancy to suit me."
"Maybe, but I'm talking to suit me. Now, for the last time, put it away."
Lemuel stared at Retief.
"You giving me orders?"
Retief's left fist shot out, smacked Lemuel's face dead center. He stumbled back, blood starting from his nose. The pistol fired into the dirt as he dropped it. He caught himself, jumped for Retief, and met a straight right that snapped him onto his back, out cold.
"Wow," said Potter. "The stranger took Lem. In 2 punches."
"1," said Swayze. "That first one was just a love tap." Bert froze.
"Hark, boys,"
he whispered. In the sudden silence, a night lizard called. Retief strained, heard nothing. He narrowed his eyes, peered past the fire. With a swift lunge, he seized up the bucket of drinking water, dashed it over the fire, threw himself flat. He heard the others hit the dirt a split second behind him. "You move fast for a city man," breathed Swayze beside him. "You see pretty good, too. We'll split and take him from 2 sides. You and Bert from the left, me and Potter from the right." "No," said Retief. "You wait here. I'm going out alone." "What's the idea?" "Later. Sit tight and keep your eyes open." Retief took a bearing on a treetop faintly visible against the sky and started forward.
5 minutes' stealthy progress brought him to a slight rise of ground. With infinite caution, he raised himself, risking a glance over an outcropping of rock. The stunted trees ended just ahead. Beyond, he could make out the dim contour of rolling desert. Flapjack country. He got to his feet, clambered over the stone, still hot after a day of tropical heat, and moved forward 20 yards. Around him, he saw nothing but drifted sand, palely visible in the starlight, and the occasional shadow of jutting shale slabs. Behind him, the jungle was still. He sat down on the ground to wait. It was 10 minutes before a movement caught his eye. Something had separated itself from a dark mass of stone, glided across a few yards of open ground to another shelter. Retief watched. Minutes passed. The shape moved again, slipped into a shadow 10 feet distant. Retief felt the butt of the power pistol with his elbow. His guess had better be right this time. There was a sudden rasp like leather against concrete, and a flurry of sand as the flapjack charged. Retief rolled aside, then lunged, threw his weight on the flopping flapjack, a yard square, 3 inches thick at the centre, and all muscle. The ray-like creature heaved up, curled backward, its edge rippling, to stand on the flattened rim of its encircling sphincter. It scrabbled with prehensile fringed tentacles for a grip on Retief's shoulders. He wrapped his arms around the alien and struggled to his feet. The thing was heavy, 100 pounds at least. Fighting as it was, it seemed more like 500. The flapjack reversed its tactics, went limp. Retief grabbed, felt a thumb slip into an orifice. The alien went wild. Retief hung on, dug the thumb in deeper. "Sorry, fellow," he muttered between clenched teeth. "Eye gouging isn't gentlemanly, but it's effective." The flapjack fell still, only its fringes rippling slowly. Retief relaxed the pressure of his thumb. The alien gave a tentative jerk. The thumb dug in. The alien went limp again, waiting. "Now we understand each other," said Retief. "Take me to your leader." 20 minutes' walk into the desert brought Retief to a low rampart of thorn branches, the flapjack's outer defensive line against terry forays. It would be as good a place as any to wait for the move by the flapjacks. He sat down and eased the weight of his captive off his back, but kept a firm thumb in place. If his analysis of the situation was correct, a flapjack picket should be along before too long. A penetrating beam of red light struck Retief in the face, blinked off. He got to his feet. The captive flapjack rippled its fringe in an agitated way. Retief tensed his thumb in the eye socket. "Sit tight," he said. "Don't try to do anything hasty." His remarks were falling on deaf ears, or no ears at all, but the thumb spoke as loudly as words. There was a slither of sand. Another. He became aware of a ring of presences drawing closer. Retief tightened his grip on the alien. He could see a dark shape now, looming up almost to his own 6'3". It looked like the flapjacks came in all sizes. A low rumble sounded, like a deep-throated growl. It strummed on, faded out. Retief cocked his head, frowning. "Try it 2 octaves higher," he said. "Oh? Sorry, is that better?" A clear voice came from the darkness. "That's fine," Retief said. "I'm here to arrange a prisoner exchange." "Prisoners? But we have no prisoners." "Sure you have. Me. Is it a deal?" "Ah, yes, of course. Quite equitable. What guarantees do you require?" "The word of a gentleman is sufficient." Retief released the alien. It flopped once, disappeared into the darkness. "If you'd care to accompany me to our headquarters," the voice said, "we can discuss our mutual concerns in comfort." "Delighted." Red lights blinked briefly. Retief glimpsed a gap in the thorny barrier, stepped through it. He followed dim shapes across warm sand to a low cave-like entry, faintly lit with a reddish glow. "I must apologize for the awkward design of our comfort dome," said the voice. "Had we known we would be honored by a visit." "Think nothing of it," Retief said. "We diplomats are trained to crawl." Inside, with knees bent and head ducked under the 5-foot ceiling, Retief looked around at the walls of pink-toned nacre, a floor like burgundy-coloured grass spread with silken rugs, and a low table of polished red granite that stretched down the centre of the spacious room, set out with silver dishes and rose crystal drinking tubes.
"Let me congratulate you,"
the voice said. Retief turned. An immense flapjack hung with crimson trappings rippled at his side. The voice issued from a disc strapped to its back. "You fight well. I think we will find in each other worthy adversaries." "Thanks. I'm sure the test would be interesting, but I'm hoping we can avoid it."
"Avoid it?"
Retief heard a low humming coming from the speaker in the silence.
"Well, let us dine,"
the mighty flapjack said at last.
"We can resolve these matters later. I am called Hoshik of the Mosaic of the Two Dawns."
"I'm Retief." Hoshik waited expectantly. "Of the Mountain of Red Tape," Retief added.
"Take place, Retief," said Hoshik. "I hope you won't find our rude couches uncomfortable."
2 other large flapjacks came into the room, communed silently with Hoshik.
"Pray forgive our lack of translating devices," he said to Retief. "Permit me to introduce my colleagues."
A small flapjack rippled the chamber, bearing on its back a silver tray laden with aromatic food. The waiter served the 4 diners, filled the drinking tubes with yellow wine. It smelled good.
"I trust you'll find these dishes palatable," said Hoshik. "Our metabolisms are much alike, I believe."
Retief tried the food. It had a delicious nut-like flavour. The wine was indistinguishable from Chateau d'Yquem.
"It was an unexpected pleasure to encounter your party here," said Hoshik. "I confess at first we took you for an indigenous earth-grubbing form, but we were soon disabused of that notion."
He raised a tube, manipulating it deftly with his fringed tentacles. Retief returned the salute and drank.
"Of course," Hoshik continued, "as soon as we realized that you were sportsmen like ourselves, we attempted to make amends by providing a bit of activity for you. We've ordered out our heavier equipment and a few trained skirmishers, and soon we'll be able to give you an adequate show. Or so I hope."
"Additional skirmishers?" said Retief. "How many, if you don't mind my asking?"
"For the moment, perhaps only a few hundred. Thereafter, well, I'm sure we can arrange that between us. Personally, I would prefer a contest of limited scope. No nuclear or radiation effect weapons. Such a bore screening the spawn for deviations. Though I confess we've come upon some remarkably useful sports. The ranger form, such as you made captive, for example. Simple-minded, of course, but a fantastically keen tracker."
"Oh, by all means," Retief said. "No atomics. As you pointed out, spawn sorting is a nuisance. And then, too, it's wasteful of troops."
"Ah, well, they are after all expendable. But we agree, no atomics. Have you tried the ground guac eggs? Rather a specialty of my mosaic."
"Delicious," said Retief.
"I wonder, have you considered eliminating weapons altogether?"
A scratchy sound issued from the disc.
"Pardon my laughter," Hoshik said, "but surely you jest."
"As a matter of fact," said Retief, "we ourselves seldom use weapons."
"I seem to recall that our first contact of skirmish forms involved the use of a weapon by one of your units."
"My apologies," said Retief.
The skirmish form failed to recognize that he was dealing with a sportsman." "Still, now that we have commenced so merrily with weapons," Hoshik signalled, and the servant refilled tubes. "There is an aspect I haven't yet mentioned," Retief went on. "I hope you won't take this personally, but the fact is our skirmish forms think of weapons as something one employs only in dealing with certain specific life forms." "Oh, curious. What forms are those?"
"Vermin, or varmints as some call them. Deadly antagonists, but lacking in caste. I don't want our skirmish forms thinking of such worthy adversaries as yourself as varmints."
"Dear me, I hadn't realized, of course. Most considerate of you to point it out." Hoshik clucked in dismay. "I see that skirmish forms are much the same among you as with us, lacking in perception." He laughed scratchily. "Imagine considering us as, what was the word, varmints? Which brings us to the crux of the matter. You see, we're up against a serious problem with regard to skirmish forms. A low birth rate. Therefore, we've reluctantly taken to substitutes for the mass action so dear to the heart of the sportsman. We've attempted to put an end to these contests altogether."
Hoshik coughed explosively, sending a spray of wine into the air. "What are you saying?" he gasped. "Are you proposing that Hoshik of the Mosaic of the Two Dawns abandon honour?" "Sir," said Retief sternly, "you forget yourself. I, Retief of the Red Tape Mountain, make an alternate proposal more in keeping with the newest sporting principles." "New?" cried Hoshik. "My dear Retief, what a pleasant surprise! I'm enthralled with novel modes. One gets so out of touch. Do elaborate." "It's quite simple, really. Each side selects a representative, and the two individuals settle the issue between them." I fear I don't understand. What possible significance could one attach to the activities of a couple of random skirmish forms?" "I haven't made myself clear," said Retief. He took a sip of wine. "We don't involve the skirmish forms at all. That's quite passé." "You don't mean—" "That's right. You and me." Outside on the starlit sand, Retief tossed aside the power pistol, followed it with the leather shirt Swayze had lent him. By the faint light he could just make out the towering figure of the flapjack rearing up before him, his trappings gone. A silent rank of flapjack retainers were grouped behind him. "I fear I must lay aside the translator now, Retief," said Hoshik. He sighed and rippled his fringed tentacles. "My spawn fellows will never credit this. Such a curious turn fashion has taken. How much more pleasant it is to observe the action of the skirmish forms from a distance." "I suggest we use Tennessee rules," said Retief. "They're very liberal. Biting, gouging, stomping, kneeing, and of course choking, as well as the usual punching, shoving and kicking." These gambits seem geared to forms employing rigid endoskeletons. I fear I shall be at a disadvantage." "Of course," Retief said, "if you'd prefer a more plebeian type of contest." "By no means, but perhaps we could rule out tentacle twisting just to even it." "Very well. Shall we begin?" With a rush, Hoshik threw himself at Retief, who ducked, whirled, and leaped on the flapjack's back, and felt himself flipped clear by a mighty ripple of the alien's slab-like body. Retief rolled aside as Hoshik turned on him. He jumped to his feet and threw a right haymaker to Hoshik's midsection. The alien whipped his left fringe around in an arc that connected with Retief's jaw, sent him spinning onto his back, and Hoshik's weight struck him. Retief twisted, tried to roll. The flat body of the alien blanketed him. He worked an arm free, drumming blows on the leathery back. Hoshik nestled closer. Retief's air was running out. He heaved up against the smothering weight. Nothing budged. It was like burial under a dump truck load of concrete. He remembered the ranger form he had captured. The sensitive orifice had been placed ventrally, in what would be the thoracic area. He groped, felt tough hide set with horny granules. He would be missing skin tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow. His thumb found the orifice and probed. The flapjack recoiled. Retief held fast, probed deeper, groping with the other hand. If the alien were bilaterally symmetrical, there would be a set of ready-made handholds. There were. Retief dug in, and the flapjack writhed, pulled away. Retief held on, scrambled to his feet, threw his weight against the alien and fell on top of him, still gouging. Hoshik rippled his fringe wildly, flopped in terror, then went limp. Retief relaxed, released his hold, and got to his feet, breathing hard. Hoshik humped himself over onto his ventral side, lifted, and moved gingerly over to the sidelines. His retainers came forward, assisted him into his trappings, strapped on the translator. He sighed heavily, adjusted the volume. "There is much to be said for the old system," he said. "What a burden one's sportsmanship places on one at times." "Great sport, wasn't it?" said Retief. "Now, I know you'll be eager to continue. If you'll just wait while I run back and fetch some of our gouger forms." "May hide ticks devour the gouger forms," Hoshik bellowed. "You've given me such a sprong ache as I'll remember each spawning time for a year." "Speaking of hide ticks," said Retief, "we've developed a biter form." "Enough!" Hoshik roared so loudly that the translator bounced on his hide. "Suddenly I yearn for the crowded yellow sands of Jack. I had hoped," he broke off, drew a rasping breath. "I had hoped, Retief," he said, speaking sadly now, "to find a new land here, where I might plan my own mosaic, till these alien sands, and bring forth a crop of paradise lichen as should glut the markets of 100 worlds. But my spirit is not equal to the prospect of bitiforms and gougiforms without end. I am shamed before you. To tell you the truth, I'm old-fashioned myself. I'd rather watch the action from a distance too. But surely your spawn fellows would never condone such an attitude? My spawn fellows aren't here. And besides, didn't I mention it? No one who's really in the know would think of engaging in competition by mere combat if there were any other way. Now, you mentioned tilling the sand, raising lichens, things like that. That on which we dined but now, said Hoshik, and from which the wine is made. The big news in fashionable diplomacy today is farming competition. Now, if you'd like to take these deserts and raise lichen, we'll promise to stick to the oases and vegetables. Hoshik curled his back in attention. Retief, you're quite serious. You would leave all the fair sand hills to us? The whole works, Hoshik. I'll take the oases. Hoshik rippled his fringes ecstatically. Once again you have outdone me, Retief, he cried. This time in generosity. We'll talk over the details later. I'm sure we can establish a set of rules that will satisfy all parties. Now, I've got to get back. I think some of the gougiforms are waiting to see me. It was nearly dawn when Retief gave the whistled signal he had agreed on with Potter, then rose and walked into the camp circle. Swayze stood up. There you are, he said. We've been wondering whether to go out after you. Lemuel came forward, one eye black to the cheekbone. He held out a raw-boned hand. Sorry I jumped you, stranger. Tell you the truth, I thought you were some kind of stool pigeon from the CDT. Bert came up behind Lemuel. How do you know he ain't, Lemuel? He said. Maybe he... Lemuel floored Bert with a backward sweep of his arm. Next cotton picker says some embassy Johnny can call me gets worse than that. Tell me, said Retief, how are you boys fixed for wine? Wine? Mister, we've been living on stump water for a year now. Dauby's fatal to the kind of bacteria it takes to ferment liquor. Try this. Retief handed over a squat jug. Swayze drew the cork, sniffed, drank and passed it to Lemuel. Mister, where do you get that? The Flapjacks make it. Here's another question for you. Would you concede a share in this planet to the Flapjacks in return for a peace guarantee? At the end of a half-hour of heated debate, Lemuel turned to Retief. We'll make any reasonable deal, he said. I guess they got as much right here as we have. I think we'd agree to a 50-50 split. That'd give about 150 oases to each side. What would you say to keeping all the oases and giving them the desert? Lemuel reached for the wine jug, eyes on Retief. Keep talking, mister, he said. I think you got yourself a deal. Consul Paswin glanced up at Retief, went on perusing a paper. Sit down, Retief, he said absently. I thought you were over on Pueblo, or Mudflat, or whatever they call that desert. I'm back. Paswin eyed him sharply. Well, what is it you need, man? Speak up. Don't expect me to request any military assistance, no matter how things are. Retief passed a bundle of documents across the desk. Here's the treaty, and a mutual assistance pact declaration, and a trade agreement. Eh? Paswin picked up the papers, riffled through them. He leaned back in his chair, beamed. Well, Retief, expeditiously handled. He stopped, blinked at Retief. You seem to have a bruise on your jaw. I hope you've been conducting yourself as befits a member of the embassy staff. I attended a sporting event, Retief said. One of the players got a little excited. Well, it's one of the hazards of the profession. One must pretend an interest in such matters. Paswin rose, extended a hand. You've done well, my boy. Let this teach you the value of following instructions to the letter. Outside, by the hall incinerator drop, Retief paused long enough to take from his briefcase a large buff envelope, still sealed, and drop it in the slot. Operation R.S.V.P. by H. Beam Piper. Narrated by William Skye. Bombs, guided missiles, bacteria. None is as deadly as a glib-tongued diplomat. Vladimir N. Zhubinsky, Foreign Minister, Union of East European Soviet Republics, to Wu Fengtung, Foreign Minister, United People's Republics of East Asia. 15th of January 1984. Honoured Sir, pursuant to our well-known policy of exchanging military and scientific information with the government of friendly powers, my government takes great pleasure in announcing the completely successful final tests of our new nuclear rocket-guided missile, Marxist Victory. The test launching was made from a position south of Lake Balkhash. The target was located in the East Siberian Sea. In order to assist you in appreciating the range of the new guided missile, Marxist Victory, let me point out that the distance from launching site to target is somewhat over 50% greater than the distance from launching site to your capital, Nanking. My government is still hopeful that your government will revise its present intransigent position on the Khakum River dispute. I have the honour, etc., 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 V. N. Zhubinsky. Wu Fengtung to Vladimir N. Zhubinsky, 7th of February 1984. Estimable Sir, my government was most delighted to learn of the splendid triumph of your government in developing the new guided missile Marxist Victory, and at the same time deeply relieved. We had, of course, detected the release of nuclear energy incident to the test, and inasmuch as it had obviously originated in the disintegration of a quantity of uranium-235, we had feared that an explosion had occurred at your government's secret uranium plant at Katanga. We have long known of the lax security measures in effect at this plant, and have as a consequence been expecting some disaster there. I am therefore sure that your government will be equally gratified to learn of the perfection, by my government, of our own new guided missile, Celestial Destroyer, which embodies in greatly improved form many of the features of your own government's guided missile Marxist Victory. Naturally, your own scientific warfare specialists have detected the release of energy incident to the explosion of our own improved thorium-hafnium interaction bomb. This bomb was exploded over the North Polar ice cap, about 200 miles south of the pole, on about 35 degrees east longitude, almost due north of your capital city of Moscow. The launching was made from a site in Tibet. Naturally, my government cannot deviate from our present just and reasonable attitude in the Khakum River question. Trusting that your government will realize this, I have the honor to be your obedient and respectful servant, Wu Fengtung. From New York Times, February 20th, 1984. Afghan ruler fated at Nanking. Amir Shir Ali Abdallah confers with UPREA President Sung Lee Yin. UEESR Foreign Minister Zhubinsky to Maxim G. Kirilenkov, Ambassador at Nanking. 3rd of March 1984. Comrade Ambassador, it is desired that you make immediate secret and confidential inquiry as to the whereabouts of Dr. Dmitry O. Voronov, the noted Soviet rocket expert, designer of the new guided missile Marxist Victory, who vanished a week ago from the Yosef Vissarionovich Jugashvili reaction propulsion laboratories at Molotovgorod. It is feared in government circles that this noted scientist has been abducted by agents of the United People's Republics of East Asia, possibly to extract from him, under torture, information of a secret technical nature. As you know, this is but the latest of a series of such disappearances, beginning about 5 years ago when the Khakum River question first arose. Your utmost activity in this matter is required. Zhubinsky. Ambassador Kirilenkov to Foreign Minister Zhubinsky. 9th of March 1984. Comrade Foreign Minister, since receipt of yours of 3rd of the 3rd, 84, I have been utilizing all resources at my disposal in the matter of the noted scientist D. O. Voronov, and availing myself of all sources of information, e.g. spies, secret agents, disaffected elements of the local population, and including 2 UPREA cabinet ministers on my payroll.
I regret to report the results of this investigation have been entirely negative. No one here appears to know anything of the whereabouts of Dr. Voronov. At the same time, there is considerable concern in UPREA government circles over the disappearances of certain prominent East Asian scientists, e.g. Dr. Hong Fu, the nuclear physicist, Dr. Hin Yang Wu, the great theoretical mathematician, Dr. Meng Xing, the electronics expert. I am informed that UPREA government sources are attributing these disappearances to us. I can only say that I am sincerely sorry that this is not the case. Kirilenkov. Wu Feng-tung to Vladimir N. Zhubinsky, 21st of April 1984. Estimable Sir, in accordance with our established policy of free exchange with friendly powers of scientific information, permit me to inform your government that a new mutated disease virus has been developed in our biological laboratories, causing a highly contagious disease similar in symptoms to bubonic plague, but responding to none of the treatments for this latter disease. This new virus strain was accidentally produced in the course of some experiments with radioactivity. In spite of the greatest care, it is feared that this virus has spread beyond the laboratory in which it was developed. We warn you most urgently of the danger that it may have spread to the UEESR. Enclosed are a list of symptoms, etc. My government instructs me to advise your government that the attitude of your government in the Khartoum River question is utterly unacceptable and will require considerable revision before my government can even consider negotiation with your government on the subject. Your obedient and respectful servant, Wu Feng-tung. From New York Times, May 12, 1984. Afghan ruler fated at Moscow. Amir sees Red Square troop review. Confers with Premier President Muzorgin. Singh Yat, UPREA ambassador at Moscow, to Wu Feng-tung, 26th of June 1984. Venerable and honoured Sir, I regret humbly that I can learn nothing whatever about the fate of the learned scholars of science of whom you inquire, namely Hong Fu, Hin Yang Wu, Meng Xing, Li Ho Li, Wang Fat, and Bao Hu Xin. This inability may be in part due to incompetence of my unworthy self, but none of my many sources of information, including Soviet Minister of Police Morgadov, who is on my payroll, can furnish any useful data whatever. I am informed, however, that the UEESR government is deeply concerned about similar disappearances of some of the foremost of their own scientists, including Voronov, Yernikov, Kagorinov, Bakorin, Himmelfarber, and Pavlovinsky, all of whose dossiers are on file with our Bureau of Foreign Intelligence. I am further informed that the government of the UEESR ascribes these disappearances to our own activities. Ah, venerable and honoured Sir, if this were only true! Kindly condescend to accept compliments of Singh Yat. Zhubinsky to Wu Feng-tung, 6th of October 1984. Honoured Sir, pursuant to our well-known policy of exchanging scientific information with the governments of friendly powers, my government takes the greatest pleasure in announcing a scientific discovery of inestimable value to the entire world. I refer to nothing less than a positive technique for liquidating rats as a species. This technique involves treatment of male rats with certain types of hard radiations, which not only renders them reproductively sterile, but leaves the rodents so treated in full possession of all other sexual functions and impulses. Furthermore, this condition of sterility is venereally contagious, so that one male rat so treated will sterilize all female rats with which it comes in contact, and these, in turn, will sterilize all male rats coming in contact with them. Our mathematicians estimate that even under moderately favorable circumstances, the entire rat population of the world could be sterilized from one male rat in approximately 200 years. Rats so treated have already been liberated in the granaries at Odessa. In 3 months, rat trappings there have fallen by 26.4%, and grain losses to rats by 32.09%. We are shipping you 6 dozen sterilized male rats which you can use for sterilization stock, and, by so augmenting their numbers, may duplicate our own successes. Curiously enough,
This effect of venereally contagious sterility was discovered quite accidentally, in connection with the use of hard radiations for human sterilization, criminals, mental defectives, etc. Knowing the disastrous possible effects of an epidemic of contagious human sterility, all persons so sterilized were liquidated as soon as the contagious nature of their sterility had been discovered, with the exception of a dozen or so convicts, who had been released before this discovery was made. It is believed that at least some of them have made their way over the border and into the territory of the United Peoples' Republics of East Asia. I must caution your government to be on the lookout of them. Among a people still practicing ancestor worship, an epidemic of sterility would be a disaster indeed. My government must insist that your government take some definite step toward the solution of the Khartoum River question. The present position of the government of the United Peoples' Republics of East Asia on this subject is utterly unacceptable to the government of the Union of East European Soviet Republics, and must be revised very considerably. I have the honor, etc., etc. Vladimir N. Zhubinsky. Coded radiogram Zhubinsky to Krylenkov, 25th of October 1984. Ascertain immediately cause of release of nuclear energy vicinity of Nova Zembla this AM. Zhubinsky. Coded radiogram Wu Fengtung to Sing Yat, 25th of October 1984. Ascertain immediately cause of release of nuclear energy vicinity of Nova Zembla this AM. Wu. Letter from the Emir of Afghanistan to UEESR Premier President Muzorgin and UPREA President Sung Lee Yin. 26th of October, 1984. Shir Ali Abdallah, Emir of Afghanistan, Master of Kabul, Lord of Herat and Kandahar, Keeper of Khyber Pass, Defender of the True Faith, Servant of the Most High and Sword Hand of the Prophet, PhD Princeton, SCB Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MA Oxford. To their Excellencies A.A. Muzorgin, Premier President of the Union of East European Soviet Republics, and Sung Lee Yin, President of the United Peoples' Republics of East Asia. Greetings in the name of Allah. For the past 5 years I have watched, with growing concern, the increasing tensions between your Excellencies' respective governments, allegedly arising out of the so-called Khartoum River question. It is my conviction that this Khartoum River dispute is the utterly fraudulent device by which both governments hope to create a pretext for the invasion of India, each ostensibly to rescue that unhappy country from the rapacity of the other. Your Excellencies must surely realize that this is a contingency which the government of the Kingdom of Afghanistan cannot and will not permit. It would mean nothing short of the national extinction of the Kingdom of Afghanistan and the enslavement of the Afghan people. Your Excellencies will recall that I discussed this matter most urgently on the occasions of my visits to your respective capitals of Moscow and Nanking, and your respective attitudes on those occasions has firmly convinced me that neither of your Excellencies is by nature capable of adopting a rational or civilized attitude toward this question. It appears that neither of your Excellencies has any intention of abandoning your present war of mutual threats and blackmail until forced to do so by some overt act on the part of one or the other of your Excellencies' governments, which would result in physical war of pan-Asiatic scope and magnitude. I am further convinced that this deplorable situation arises out of the megalomaniac ambitions of the federal governments of the UEESR and the UPREA, respectively, and that the different peoples of what you unblushingly call your autonomous republics have no ambitions except, on a rapidly diminishing order of probability, to live out their natural span of years in peace. Therefore, in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate, we, Shir Ali Abdallah, Amir of Afghanistan, etc., do decree and command that the political entities known as the Union of East European Soviet Republics and the United Peoples' Republics of East Asia, respectively, are herewith abolished and dissolved into their constituent autonomous republics, each one of which shall hereafter enjoy complete sovereignty within its own borders, as is right and proper. Now, in case either of you gentlemen feel inclined to laugh this off, let me remind you of the series of mysterious disappearances of some of the most noted scientists,
of both the UEESR and the UPREA, and let me advise your excellencies that these scientists are now residents and subjects of the Kingdom of Afghanistan, and are here engaged in research and development work for my government. These gentlemen were not abducted, as you gentlemen seem to believe. They came here of their own free will, and ask nothing better than to remain here, where they are treated with dignity and honour, given material rewards, riches, palaces, harems, retinues of servants, etc., and are also free from the intellectual and ideological restraints which make life so intolerable in your respective countries to any man above the order of intelligence of a cretin. In return for these benefactions, these eminent scientists have developed for my government certain weapons. For example, 1. A nuclear rocket-guided missile, officially designated as the Sword of Islam, vastly superior to your excellencies' respective guided missiles Marxist Victory and Celestial Destroyer. It should be. It was the product of the joint efforts of Dr. Voronov and Dr. Bao Hu Xin, whom your excellencies know. 2. A new type of radar radio-electronic defense screen, which can not only detect the approach of a guided missile at any velocity whatever, but will automatically capture and redirect same. In case either of your excellencies doubt this statement, you are invited to aim a rocket at some target in Afghanistan and see what happens. 3. Both the UPREA mutated virus and the UEESR contagious sterility, with positive vaccines against the former and means of instrumental detection of the latter. 4. A technique for initiating and controlling the beta-carbon-hydrogen cycle. We are now using this as a source of heat for industrial and even domestic purposes, and we also have a carbon-hydrogen cycle bomb. Such a bomb, delivered by one of our Sword of Islam Mark IVs, was activated yesterday over the northern tip of Nova Zembla at an altitude of 4 miles. I am enclosing photographic reproductions of views of this test, televised to Kabul by an accompanying Sword of Islam Mark V observation rocket. I am informed that expeditions have been sent by both the UEESR and the UPREA to investigate. They should find some very interesting conditions. For one thing, they won't need their climbing equipment to get over the Nova Zembla Glacier. The Nova Zembla Glacier isn't there anymore. 5. A lithium bomb. This has not been tested yet. A lithium bomb is nothing for a country the size of Afghanistan to let off inside its own borders. We intend making a test with it within the next 10 days. However, if your excellencies will designate a target, which must be at the centre of an uninhabited area at least 500 miles square, the test can be made in perfect safety. If not, I cannot answer the results. That will be in the hands of Allah, who has ordained all things. No doubt Allah has ordained the destruction of either Moscow or Nanking. Whichever city Allah has elected to erase, I will make it my personal responsibility to see to it that the other isn't slighted either. However, if your excellencies decide to accede to my modest and reasonable demands, not later than 1 week from today, this test launching will be cancelled as unnecessary. Of course, that would leave unsettled a bet I have made with Dr. Hong Fu, a star sapphire against his favourite Persian concubine, that the explosion of a lithium bomb will not initiate a chain reaction in the Earth's crust and so disintegrate this planet. This, of course, is a minor consideration, unworthy of your notice. Of course, I am aware that both your excellencies have, in the past, fomented mutual jealousies and suspicions among the several autonomous republics under your respective jurisdictions as an instrument of policy. If these people were, at this time, to receive full independence, the present inevitability of a pan-Asiatic war on a grand scale would be replaced only by the inevitability of a pan-Asiatic war by detail. Obviously, some single supranational sovereignty is needed to maintain peace, and such a sovereignty should be established under some leadership not hitherto associated with either the former UEESR or the former UPREA. I humbly offer myself as president of such a supranational organisation, counting as a matter of course upon the wholehearted support and cooperation of both your excellencies. It might be well if both your excellencies were to come here to Kabul to confer with me on this subject at your very earliest convenience. The peace of Allah be upon both your excellencies. Shia Ali Abdallah, PhD, SCB, MA. From New York Times, October 30th, 1984. Muzorgin, Sun Li Yin, fated at Kabul. Confer with Amir. Discuss peace plans. Surprise development scene. Remember to hit the like button if you're enjoying the stories, and subscribe for more stories every Monday and Friday. Happy Ending by Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore. Narrated by William Skye. Out of the future emerge the robot and Tharn, while James Kelvin fights them blindly, knowing not friend from foe. This is the way the story ended. James Kelvin concentrated very hard on the thought of the chemist with the red moustache who had promised him $1 million. It was simply a matter of tuning in on the man's brain, establishing a rapport. He had done it before. Now it was more important than ever that he do it this one last time. He pressed the button on the gadget the robot had given him and thought hard. Far off across limitless distances, he found the rapport. He clamped on the mental tight beam. He rode it. The red-moustached man looked up, gaped, and grinned delightedly. "So there you are," he said. "I didn't hear you come in. Good grief, I've been trying to find you for 2 weeks." "Tell me one thing quick," Kelvin said. "What's your name?" "George Bailey. Incidentally, what's yours?" But Kelvin didn't answer. He had suddenly remembered the other thing the robot had told him about that gadget which established rapport when he pressed the button. He pressed it now, and nothing happened. The gadget had gone dead. Its task was finished, which obviously meant he had at last achieved health, fame, and fortune. The robot had warned him, of course. The thing was set to do one specialized job. Once he got what he wanted, it would work no more. So Kelvin got the $1 million, and he lived happily ever after. This is the middle of the story. As he pushed aside the canvas curtain, something, a carelessly hung rope, swung down at his face, knocking the horn-rimmed glasses askew. Simultaneously, a vivid bluish light blazed into his unprotected eyes. He felt a curious, sharp sense of disorientation, a shifting motion that was almost instantly gone. Things steadied before him. He let the curtain fall back into place, making legible again the painted inscription, "Horoscopes, learn your future," and he stood staring at the remarkable horomancer. It was impossible, the robot said in a flat, precise voice. "You are James Kelvin. You are a reporter. You are 30 years old, unmarried, and you came to Los Angeles from Chicago today on the advice of your physician. Is that correct?" In his astonishment, Kelvin called on the deity. Then he settled his glasses more firmly and tried to remember an exposé of charlatans he had once written. There was some obvious way they worked things like this, miraculous as it sounded. The robot looked at him impassively out of its faceted eye. "On reading your mind," it continued in the pedantic voice, "I find this is the year 1949. My plans will have to be revised. I had meant to arrive in the year 1970. I will ask you to assist me." Kelvin put his hands in his pockets and grinned. "With money, naturally," he said. "You had me going for a minute. How do you do it, anyhow? Mirrors? Or like Maelzel's chess player?" "I am not a machine operated by a dwarf, nor am I an optical illusion," the robot assured him. "I am an artificially created living organism, originating at a period far in your future." "And I'm not the sucker you take me for," Kelvin remarked pleasantly. "I came in here to—" "You lost your baggage checks," the robot said. "While wondering what to do about it, you had a few drinks and took the Wilshire bus at exactly 8:35 post-meridian." "Lay off the mind-reading," Kelvin said. "And don't tell me you've been running this joint very long with a line like that. The cops would be after you. If you're a real robot. Ha ha." "I have been running this joint," the robot said, "for approximately 5 minutes. My predecessor is unconscious behind that chest in the corner. Your arrival here was sheer coincidence." It paused very briefly, and Kelvin had the curious impression that it was watching to see if the story so far had gone over well. The impression was curious because Kelvin had no feeling at all that there was a man in the large jointed figure before him. If such a thing as a robot were possible, he would have believed implicitly that he confronted a genuine specimen. Such things being impossible, he waited to see what the gimmick would be. "My arrival here was also accidental," the robot informed him.
This being the case, my equipment will have to be altered slightly. I will require certain substitute mechanisms. For that, I gather as I read your mind, I will have to engage in your peculiar barter system of economics. In a word, coinage or gold or silver certificates will be necessary. Thus, I am, temporarily, a horomancer. Sure, Kelvin said. Why not a simple mugging? If you're a robot, you could do a super mugging job with a quick twist of the gears. It would attract attention. Above all, I require secrecy. As a matter of fact, I am, the robot paused, searched Kelvin's brain for the right phrase, and said, on the lam. In my era, time travelling is strictly forbidden, even by accident, unless government-sponsored. There was a fallacy there somewhere, Kelvin thought, but he couldn't quite spot it. He blinked at the robot intently. It looked pretty unconvincing. What proof do you need? The creature asked. I read your brain the minute you came in, didn't I? You must have felt the temporary amnesia as I drew out the knowledge and then replaced it. So that's what happened, Kelvin said. He took a cautious step backward. Well, I think I'll be getting along. Wait, the robot commanded. I see you have begun to distrust me. Apparently you now regret having suggested a mugging job. You fear I may act on the suggestion. Allow me to reassure you. It is true that I could take your money and assure secrecy by killing you, but I am not permitted to kill humans. The alternative is to engage in the barter system. I can offer you something valuable in return for a small amount of gold. Let me see. The faceted gaze swept around the tent, dwelt piercingly for a moment on Kelvin. A horoscope, the robot said. It is supposed to help you achieve health, fame, and fortune. Astrology, however, is out of my line. I can merely offer a logical scientific method of attaining the same results. Uh-huh, Kelvin said skeptically. How much? And why haven't you used that method? I have other ambitions, the robot said in a cryptic manner. Take this. There was a brief clicking. A panel opened in the metallic chest. The robot extracted a small, flat case and handed it to Kelvin, who automatically closed his fingers on the cold metal. Be careful. Don't push that button until... But Kelvin had pushed it. He was driving a figurative car that had got out of control. There was somebody else inside his head. There was a schizophrenic double-tracked locomotive that was running wild, and his hand on the throttle couldn't slow it down an instant. His mental steering wheel had snapped. Somebody else was thinking for him. Not quite a human being. Not quite sane, probably, from Kelvin's standards. But awfully sane from his own. Sane enough to have mastered the most intricate principles of non-Euclidean geometry in the nursery. The senses get synthesized in the brain into a sort of common language, a master tongue. Part of it was auditory, part pictorial, and there were smells and tastes and tactile sensations that were sometimes familiar and sometimes spiced with the absolute alien. And it was chaotic. Something like this, perhaps. Big lizards getting too numerous this season. Tame Threvals have the same eyes, not on Callisto though. Vacation soon, preferably galactic. Solar system claustrophobic. Bianding tomorrow if square Rutola and upsliding 3. But that was merely the word symbolism. Subjectively, it was far more detailed and very frightening. Luckily, reflex had lifted Kelvin's finger from the button almost instantly, and he stood there motionless, shivering slightly. He was afraid now. The robot said, You should not have begun the rapport until I instructed you. Now there will be danger. Wait. His eye changed colour. Yes, there is. Tharn, yes. Beware of Tharn. I don't want any part of it, Kelvin said quickly. Here, take this thing back. Then you will be unprotected against Tharn. Keep the device. It will, as I promised, ensure your health, fame, and fortune, far more effectively than a horoscope. No thanks. I don't know how you managed that trick. Subsonics, maybe, but I don't... Wait, the robot said. When you pressed that button, you were in the mind of someone who exists very far in the future. It created a temporal rapport. You can bring about that rapport any time you press the button. Heaven forfend, Kelvin said, still sweating a little. Consider the opportunities. Suppose a troglodyte of the far past had access to your brain. He could achieve anything he wanted. It had become important, somehow, to find a logical rebuttal to the robot's arguments. Like St. Anthony, or was it Luther, arguing with the devil? Kelvin thought dizzily. His headache was worse, and he suspected he had drunk more than was good for him. But he merely said, How could a troglodyte understand what's in my brain? He couldn't apply the knowledge without the same conditioning I've had. Have you ever had sudden and apparently illogical ideas? Compulsions, so that you seem forced to think of certain things, count up to certain numbers, work out particular problems? Well, the man in the future on whom my device is focused doesn't know he's en rapport with you, Kelvin. But he's vulnerable to compulsions.
All you have to do is concentrate on a problem and then press the button. Your rapport will be compelled, illogically from his viewpoint, to solve that problem. And you'll be reading his brain. You'll find out how it works. There are limitations, you'll learn those too. And the device will ensure health, wealth, and fame for you. It would ensure anything if it really worked that way. I could do anything. That's why I'm not buying. I said there were limitations. As soon as you've successfully achieved health, fame, and fortune, the device will become useless. I've taken care of that, but meanwhile you can use it to solve all your problems by tapping the brain of the more intelligent specimen in the future. The important point is to concentrate on your problems before you press the button. Otherwise you may get more than Tharn on your track. Tharn? What? I think an android, the robot said, looking at nothing. An artificial human. However, let us consider my own problem. I need a small amount of gold. So that's the kicker, Kelvin said, feeling oddly relieved. He said, I haven't got any. Your watch? Kelvin jerked his arm so that his wristwatch showed. Oh no, that watch cost plenty. All I need is the gold plating, the robot said, shooting out a reddish ray from its eye. Thank you. The watch was now dull grey metal. Hey, Kelvin cried. If you use the rapport device, your health, fame, and fortune will be assured, the robot said rapidly. You will be as happy as any man of this era can be. It will solve all your problems, including Tharn. Wait a minute. The creature took a backward step and disappeared behind a hanging oriental rug that had never been east of Peoria. There was silence. Kelvin looked from his altered watch to the flat, enigmatic object in his palm. It was about 2 inches by 2 inches, and no thicker than a woman's vanity case, and there was a sunken push button on its side. He dropped it into his pocket and took a few steps forward. He looked behind the pseudo-oriental rug to find nothing except emptiness and a flapping slit cut in the canvas wall of the booth. The robot, it seemed, had taken a powder. Kelvin peered out through the slit. There was the light and sound of Ocean Park Amusement Pier, that was all, and the silvered moving blackness of the Pacific Ocean, stretching to where small lights showed Malibu far up the invisible curve of the coastal cliffs. So he came back inside the booth and looked around. A fat man in a Swami's costume was unconscious behind the carved chest the robot had indicated. His breath, plus a process of deduction, told Kelvin that the man had been drinking. Not knowing what else to do, Kelvin called on the deity again. He found suddenly that he was thinking about someone or something called Tharn, who was an android. Horomancy? Time? Rapport? No! Protective disbelief slid like plate armor around his mind. A practical robot couldn't be made. He knew that. He'd have heard. He was a reporter, wasn't he? Sure he was. Desiring noise and company, he went along to the shooting gallery and knocked down a few ducks. The flat case burned in his pocket. The dully burnished metal of his wristwatch burned in his memory. The remembrance of that drainage from his brain and the immediate replacement burned in his mind. Presently, bar whiskey burned in his stomach. He'd left Chicago because of sinusitis, recurrent and annoying. Ordinary sinusitis, not schizophrenia or hallucinations or accusing voices coming from the walls. Not because he had been seeing bats or robots. That thing hadn't really been a robot. It all had a perfectly natural explanation. Oh, sure. Health, fame, and fortune. And if Tharn... The thought crashed with thunderbolt impact into his head, and then another thought. I am going nuts. A silent voice began to mutter insistently, over and over. Tharn, 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 Tharn. And another voice, the voice of sanity and safety, answered it and drowned it out. Half aloud, Kelvin muttered. I'm James Noel Kelvin. I'm a reporter, special features, legwork, rewrite. I'm 30 years old, unmarried, and I came to Los Angeles today and lost my baggage checks and I'm going to have another drink and find a hotel. Anyhow, the climate seems to be curing my sinusitis. Tharn, the muffled drumbeat said, almost below the threshold of realization. Tharn, Tharn, Tharn. He ordered another drink and reached in his pocket for a coin. His hand touched the metal case, and simultaneously he felt a light pressure on his shoulder. Instinctively he glanced around. It was a 7-fingered spidery hand tightening, hairless, without nails, and white as smooth ivory. The one overwhelming necessity that sprang into Kelvin's mind was a simple longing to place as much space as possible between himself and the owner of that disgusting hand. It was a vital requirement, but one difficult of fulfillment, a problem that excluded everything else from Kelvin's thoughts. He knew vaguely that he was gripping the flat case in his pocket, as though that could save him, but all he was thinking was, I've got to get away from here. The monstrous alien thoughts of someone in the future spun him insanely along their current.
It could not have taken a moment while that skilled, competent, trained mind, wise in the lore of an unthinkable future, solved the random problem that had come so suddenly, with such curious compulsion. 3 methods of transportation were simultaneously clear to Kelvin. 2 he discarded. Motorplats were obviously inventions yet to come, and quirling, involving as it did a sensory coil helmet, was beyond him. But the 3rd method... Already the memory was fading, and that hand was still tightening on his shoulder. He clutched at the vanishing ideas and desperately made his brain and his muscles move along the unlikely direction the future man had visualized. And he was out in the open, a cold night wind blowing on him, still in a sitting position, but with nothing but empty air between his spine and the sidewalk. He sat down suddenly. Passers-by on the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Cahuenga were not much surprised at the sight of a dark, lanky man sitting by the curb. Only one woman had noticed Kelvin's actual arrival, and she knew when she was well off. She went right on home. Kelvin got up, laughing with soft hysteria. "Teleportation," he said. "How did I work it? It's gone. Hard to remember afterward, eh? I'll have to start carrying a notebook again. And then, but what about Tharn?" He looked around, frightened. Reassurance came only after half an hour had passed without additional miracles. Kelvin walked along the boulevard, keeping a sharp lookout. No Tharn, though. Occasionally he slid a hand into his pocket and touched the cold metal of the case. Health, wealth, and fortune. Why, he could... But he did not press the button. Too vivid was the memory of that shocking alien disorientation he had felt. The mind, the experiences, the habit patterns of the far future were uncomfortably strong. He would use the little case again, oh yes, but there was no hurry. First he'd have to work out a few angles. His disbelief was completely gone. Tharn showed up the next night and scared the daylights out of Kelvin again. Prior to that, the reporter had failed to find his baggage tickets and was only consoled by the $200 in his wallet. He took a room, paying in advance, at a medium-good hotel and began wondering how he might apply his pipeline to the future. Very sensibly, he decided to continue a normal life until something developed. At any rate, he'd have to make a few connections. He tried the Times, the Examiner, the News, and some others, but these things develop slowly, except in the movies. That night, Kelvin was in his hotel room when his unwelcome guest appeared. It was, of course, Tharn. He wore a very large white turban, approximately twice the size of his head. He had a dapper black moustache waxed downwards at the tips like the moustache of a mandarin or a catfish. He stared urgently at Kelvin out of the bathroom mirror. Kelvin had been wondering whether or not he needed a shave before going out to dinner. He was rubbing his chin thoughtfully at the moment Tharn put in an appearance, and there was a perceptible mental lag between occurrence and perception, so that to Kelvin it seemed that he himself had mysteriously sprouted a long moustache. He reached for his upper lip. It was smooth, but in the glass the black waxed hairs quivered as Tharn pushed his face up against the surface of the mirror. It was so shockingly disorienting, somehow, that Kelvin was quite unable to think at all. He took a quick step backward. The edge of the bathtub caught him behind the knees and distracted him momentarily, fortunately for his sanity. When he looked again, there was only his own appalled face reflected above the washbowl. But after a second or two, the face seemed to develop a cloud of white turban, and mandarin-like whiskers began to form sketchily. Kelvin clapped a hand to his eyes and spun away. In about 15 seconds, he spread his fingers enough to peep through them at the glass. He kept his palm pressed desperately to his upper lip in some wild hope of inhibiting the sudden sprouting of a moustache. What peeped back at him from the mirror looked like himself. At least it had no turban, and it did not wear horn-rimmed glasses. He risked snatching his hand away for a quick look, and clapped it in place again just in time to prevent Tharn from taking shape in the glass. Still shielding his face, he went unsteadily into the bedroom and took the flat case out of his coat pocket. But he didn't press the button that would close a mental synapse between two incongruous eras. He didn't want to do that again, he realized. More horrible, somehow, than what was happening now was the thought of re-entering that alien brain. He was standing before the bureau, and in the mirror one eye looked out at him between reflected fingers. It was a wild eye behind the gleaming spectacle lens, but it seemed to be his own. Tentatively, he took his hand away. This mirror showed more of Tharn. Kelvin wished it hadn't. Tharn was wearing white knee boots of some glittering plastic. Between them and the turban, he wore nothing whatever except a minimum of loincloth, also glittering plastic. Tharn was very thin, but he looked active. He looked quite active enough to spring right into the hotel room. His skin was whiter than his turban, and his hands had 7 fingers each, all right. Kelvin abruptly turned away, but Tharn was resourceful. The dark window made enough of a reflecting surface to show a lean, loinclothed figure. The feet showed bare, and they were less normal than Tharn's hands. and the polished brass of a lamp base gave back the picture of a small, distorted face, not Kelvin's own. Kelvin found a corner without reflecting surfaces and pushed into it, his hands shielding his face. He was still holding the flat case. Oh, fine, he thought bitterly. Everything's got a string on it. What good will this rapport gadget do me if Tharn's going to show up every day? Maybe I'm only crazy. I hope so. Something would have to be done unless Kelvin was prepared to go through life with his face buried in his hands. The worst of it was that Tharn had a haunting look of familiarity. Kelvin discarded a dozen possibilities, from reincarnation to the déjà vu phenomenon, but he peeped through his hands in time to see Tharn raising a cylindrical gadget of some sort and levelling it like a gun. That gesture formed Kelvin's decision. He'd have to do something, and fast. So, concentrating on the problem, I want out, he pressed the button in the surface of the flat case. And instantly the teleportation method he had forgotten was perfectly clear to him. Other matters, however, were obscure. The smells, someone was thinking, were adding up to there was no word for that, only a shocking visio-auditory ideation that was simply dizzying. Someone named 3,090 Pink had written a new flatch. And there was the physical sensation of licking a $24 stamp and sticking it on a postcard. But, most important, the man in the future had had, or would have, a compulsion to think about the teleportation method, and as Kelvin snapped back into his own mind and time, he instantly used that method. He was falling. Icy water smacked him hard. Miraculously, he kept his grip on the flat case. He had a whirling vision of stars in a night sky and the phosphorescent sheen of silvery light on a dark sea. Then brine stung his nostrils. Kelvin had never learned how to swim. As he went down for the last time, bubbling a scream, he literally clutched at the proverbial straw he was holding. His finger pushed the button down again. There was no need to concentrate on the problem. He couldn't think of anything else. Mental chaos, fantastic images, and the answer. It took concentration, and there wasn't much time left. Bubbles steamed up past his face. He felt them, but he couldn't see them. All around, pressing in avidly, was the horrible coldness of the salt water. But he did know the method now, and he knew how it worked. He thought along the lines the future mind had indicated. Something happened. Radiation, that was the nearest familiar term, poured out of his brain and did peculiar things to his lung tissue. His blood cells adapted themselves. He was breathing water, and it was no longer strangling him. But Kelvin had also learned that this emergency adaptation could not be maintained for very long. Teleportation was the answer to that, and surely he could remember the method now. He had actually used it to escape from Tharn only a few minutes ago. Yet he could not remember. The memory was expunged cleanly from his mind. So there was nothing else to do but press the button again, and Kelvin did that, most reluctantly. Dripping wet, he was standing on an unfamiliar street. It was no street he knew, but apparently it was in his own time and on his own planet. Luckily, teleportation seemed to have limitations. The wind was cold. Kelvin stood in a puddle that grew rapidly around his feet. He stared around. He picked out a sign up the street that offered Turkish baths and headed moistly in that direction. His thoughts were mostly profane. He was in New Orleans, of all places. Presently he was drunk in New Orleans. His thoughts kept going around in circles, and scotch was a fine palliative, an excellent break. He needed to get control again. He had an almost miraculous power, and he wanted to be able to use it effectively before the unexpected happened again. Tharn. He sat in a hotel room and swigged scotch. Gotta be logical. He sneezed. The trouble was, of course, that there were so few points of contact between his own mind and that of the future man. Moreover, he'd got the rapport only in times of crisis. Like having access to the Alexandrian library 5 seconds a day. In 5 seconds, you couldn't even start translating. Health, fame, and fortune. He sneezed again. The robot had been a liar. His health seemed to be going fast. What about that robot? How had he got involved anyway? He said he'd fallen into this era from the future, but robots are notorious liars. Gotta be logical. Apparently the future was peopled by creatures not unlike the cast of a Frankenstein picture. Androids, robots, so-called men whose minds were shockingly different. Sneeze. Another drink. The robot had said that the case would lose its power after Kelvin had achieved health, fame, and fortune, which was a distressing thought. Suppose he attained those enviable goals, found the little push-button useless, and then Tharn showed up. Oh no. That called for another shot. Sobriety was the wrong condition in which to approach a matter that in itself was as wild as delirium tremens, even though Kelvin knew the science he had stumbled on was all theoretically quite possible. But not in this day and age. Sneeze. The trick would be to pose the right problem and use the case at some time when you weren't drowning or being menaced by that bewhiskered android with his 7-fingered hands and his ominous rod-like weapon. Find the problem. But that future mind was hideous. And suddenly, with drunken clarity, Kelvin realized that he was profoundly drawn to that dim, shadowy world of the future. He could not see its complete pattern, but he sensed it somehow. He knew that it was right, a far better world and time than this. If he could be that unknown man who dwelt there, all would go well. Man must needs love the highest, he thought wryly. Oh well. He shook the bottle. How much had he absorbed? He felt fine. Gotta be logical. Outside the window, streetlights blinked off and on. Neons traced goblin languages against the night. It seemed rather alien too, but so did Kelvin's own body. He started to laugh, but a sneeze choked that off. All I want, he thought, is health, fame and fortune. Then I'll settle down and live happily ever after, without a care or worry. I won't need this enchanted case after that. Happy ending. On impulse, he took out the box and examined it. He tried to pry it open and failed. His finger hovered over the button. How can I, he thought, and his finger moved half an inch. It wasn't so alien now that he was drunk. The future man's name was R.S.V.P. Odd he had never realized that before, but how often does a man think of his own name? R.S.V.P. was playing some sort of game vaguely reminiscent of chess, but his opponent was on a planet of Sirius, some distance away. The chessmen were all unfamiliar. Complicated, dizzying, space-time gambits flashed through R.S.V.'s mind as Kelvin listened in. Then Kelvin's problem thrust through, the compulsion hit R.S.V.P. and... It was all mixed up. There were two problems, really. How to cure a cold, coryza, and how to become healthy, rich and famous in a practically prehistoric era for R.S.V.P. A small problem, however, to R.S.V.P. He solved it and went back to his game with the Syrian. Kelvin was back in the hotel room in New Orleans. He was very drunk, or he wouldn't have risked it. The method involved using his brain to tune in on another brain in this present 20th century that had exactly the wavelength he required. All sorts of factors would build up to the sum total of that wavelength: experience, opportunity, position, knowledge, imagination, honesty. But he found it at last, after hesitating among 3 totals that were all nearly right. Still, one was righter to 3 decimal points. Still drunk as a lord, Kelvin clamped on a mental tight beam, turned on the teleportation, and rode the beam across America to a well-equipped laboratory where a man sat reading. The man was bald and had a bristling red moustache. He looked up sharply at some sound Kelvin made. "Hey," he said. "How did you get in here?" "Ask R.S.V.P," Kelvin said. "Who? What?" The man put down his book. Kelvin called on his memory. It seemed to be slipping. He used the rapport case for an instant and refreshed his mind. Not so unpleasant this time either. He was beginning to understand R.S.V.'s world a little. He liked it. However, he supposed he'd forget that too. "An improvement on Woodward's protein analogues," he told the red-moustached man. "Simple synthesis will do it." "Who the devil are you?" "Call me Jim," Kelvin said simply, "and shut up and listen." He began to explain, as to a small, stupid child. The man before him was one of America's foremost chemists. "Proteins are made of amino acids. There are about 33 amino acids." "There aren't." "There are. Shut up. Their molecules can be arranged in lots of ways, so we get an almost infinite variety of proteins. And all living things are forms of protein. The absolute synthesis involves a chain of amino acids long enough to recognize clearly as a protein molecule. That's been the trouble." The man with the red moustache seemed quite interested. "Fisher assembled a chain of 18, he said, blinking. "Abderhalden got up to 19. And Woodward, of course, has made chains 10,000 units long. But as for testing, the complete protein molecule consists of complete sets of sequences. But if you can test only 1 or 2 sections of an analog, you can't be sure of the others." "Wait a minute." Kelvin used the rapport case again. "Now I know. Well, you can make almost anything out of synthesized protein. Silk, wool, hair. But the main thing, of course," he said, sneezing, "is a cure for coryza." "Now look," said the red-moustached man. "Some of the viruses are chains of amino acids, aren't they? Well, modify their structure. Make them harmless. Bacteria, too. And synthesize antibiotics." "I wish I could. However, just call me Jim." "Yes, however, all this is old stuff." "Grab your pencil," Kelvin said. "From now on it'll be solid, with riffs. The method of synthesizing and testing is as follows." He explained, very thoroughly and clearly. He had to use the rapport case only twice, and when he had finished, the man with the red moustache laid down his pencil and stared. "This is incredible," he said, "if it works." "I want health, fame and fortune," Kelvin said stubbornly. "It'll work." Yes, but my good man, however, Kelvin insisted. Luckily for himself, the mental testing of the red-moustached man had included briefing for honesty and opportunity, and it ended with the chemist agreeing to sign partnership papers with Kelvin. The commercial possibilities of the process were unbounded. DuPont or GM would be glad to buy it. I want lots of money, a fortune. You'll make $1 million, the red-moustached man said patiently. Then I want a receipt. Have to have this in black and white, unless you want to give me my $1 million now. Frowning, the chemist shook his head. I can't do that. I'll have to run tests, open negotiations, but don't worry about that. Your discovery is certainly worth $1 million. You'll be famous, too. And healthy? There won't be any more disease after a while, the chemist said quietly. That's the real miracle. Write it down, Kelvin clamoured. All right. We can have partnership papers drawn up tomorrow. This will do temporarily. Understand the actual credit belongs to you. It's got to be in ink. A pencil won't do. Just a minute, then, the red-moustached man said, and went away in search of ink. Kelvin looked around the laboratory, beaming happily. Tharn materialized 3 feet away. Tharn was holding the rod weapon. He lifted it. Kelvin instantly used the rapport case. Then he thumbed his nose at Tharn and teleported himself far away. He was immediately in a cornfield somewhere, but undistilled corn was not what Kelvin wanted. He tried again. This time he reached Seattle. That was the beginning of Kelvin's monumental 2-week combination binge and chase. His thoughts weren't pleasant. He had a frightful hangover, 10 cents in his pocket, and an overdue hotel bill. A fortnight of keeping one jump ahead of Tharn via teleportation had frazzled his nerves so unendurably that only liquor had kept him going. Now even that stimulus was failing. The drink died in him and left what felt like a corpse. Kelvin groaned and blinked miserably. He took off his glasses and cleaned them, but that didn't help. What a fool. He didn't even know the name of that chemist. There was health, wealth, and fame waiting for him just around the corner, but what corner? Someday he'd find out, probably when the news of the new protein synthesize was publicized. But when would that be? In the meantime, what about Tharn? Moreover, the chemist couldn't locate him either. The man knew Kelvin only as Jim, which had somehow seemed a good idea at the time, but not now. Kelvin took out the rapport case and stared at it with red eyes. R.S.V.P, eh? He rather liked R.S.V.P now. Trouble was, a half hour after his rapport at most, he would forget all the details. This time he used the push button almost as Tharn snapped into bodily existence a few feet away. The teleportation angle again. He was sitting in the middle of a desert. Cactus and Joshua trees were all the scenery. There was a purple range of mountains far away. No Tharn, though. Kelvin began to be thirsty. Suppose the case stopped working now. Oh, this couldn't go on. A decision hanging fire for a week finally crystallized into a conclusion so obvious he felt like kicking himself. Perfectly obvious. Why hadn't he thought of it at the very beginning? He concentrated on the problem. How can I get rid of Tharn? He pushed the button. And a moment later, he knew the answer. It would be simple, really. The pressing urgency was gone suddenly. That seemed to release a fresh flow of thought. Everything became quite clear. He waited for Tharn. He did not have to wait long. There was a tremor in the shimmering air, and the turbaned, pallid figure sprang into tangible reality. The rod weapon was poised. Taking no chances, Kelvin posed his problem again, pressed the button, and instantly reassured himself as to the method. He simply thought in a very special and peculiar way, the way R.S.V.P had indicated. Tharn was flung back a few feet. The moustached mouth gaped open as he uttered a cry. "Don't!" the android cried. "I've been trying to—" Kelvin focused harder on his thought. Mental energy, he felt, was pouring out toward the android. Tharn croaked. "Trying! You didn't give me chance!" And then Tharn was lying motionless on the hot sand, staring blindly up. The 7-fingered hands twitched once and were still. The artificial life that had animated the android was gone. It would not return. Kelvin turned his back and drew a long, shuddering breath. He was safe. He closed his mind to all thoughts but one, all problems but one. How can I find the red-moustached man? He pressed the button. This is the way the story starts. R.S.V.P sat in the temporal warp with his android Tharn and made sure everything was under control. "How do I look?" he asked. "You'll pass," Tharn said. "Nobody will be suspicious in the era you're going to. It didn't take long to synthesize the equipment." "Not long. Clothes, they look enough like real wool and linen, I suppose. Wristwatch, money, everything in order." Wristwatch, that's odd, isn't it? Imagine people who need machinery to tell time. "Don't forget the spectacles," Tharn said. R.S.V.P put them on. But I suppose. It'll be safer. The optical properties in the lenses are a guard you may need against dangerous mental radiations. Don't take them off or the robot may try some tricks. He'd better not, R.S.V.P said. That so-and-so runaway robot. What's he up to anyway, I wonder? He always was a malcontent, but at least he knew his place. I'm sorry I ever had him made. No telling what he'll do, loose in a semi-prehistoric world, if we don't catch him and bring him home. He's in that horomancy booth, Tharn said, leaning out of the time warp. Just arrived. You'll have to catch him by surprise. And you'll need your wits about you too. Try not to go off into any more of those deep thought compulsions you've been having. They could be dangerous. That robot will use some of his tricks if he gets the chance. I don't know what powers he's developed by himself, but I do know he's an expert at hypnosis and memory erasure already. If you aren't careful, he'll snap your memory track and substitute a false brain pattern. Keep those glasses on. If anything should go wrong, I'll use the rehabilitation ray on you, eh? And he held up a small rod-like projector. R.S.V.P nodded. Don't worry, I'll be back before you know it. I have an appointment with that Syrian to finish our game this evening. It was an appointment he never kept. R.S.V.P stepped out of the temporal warp and strolled along the boardwalk toward the booth. The clothing he wore felt tight, uncomfortable, rough. He wriggled a little in it. The booth stood before him now with its painted sign. He pushed aside the canvas curtain and something, a carelessly hung rope, swung down at his face, knocking the horn-rimmed glasses askew. Simultaneously, a vivid bluish light blazed into his unprotected eyes. He felt a curious, sharp sensation of disorientation, a shifting motion that almost instantly was gone. The robot said, "You are James Kelvin?"
Thanks for listening to this compilation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember you can get even more great stories by signing up to my Patreon. The last story in this video was by Henry Kuttner. His novelette Trouble on Titan is a great listen, and you can get it now by going to patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF and signing up. Alternatively, staying on YouTube, your next video could be my compilation of 5 clever and inventive short stories. A link to that is on screen now.